What's up, creatures of the night? For this episode, it's going to be a best of. You've heard all of these stories before, but I'm going to share my top 10 favorite dogman or werewolf stories that I've presented thus far. Before each one, I'm going to give a little insight about how I found these or how I was contacted about them. So relax, kick off your shoes, grab some snacks, sit by your fire, because this episode is chock full of all of your favorite cryptid dogmen. Also, if you still haven't got a copy of my novel, the link is in the description below. I got Kindle, I got paperback, I got hardback. Hardback covers the coolest. Also, share this channel. Let's get some more subscribers. And don't forget to smash that like button. Enjoy, guys. And remember, don't miss your chance to scream. This one might just be my very favorite encounter that I have ever read to you guys. She was the first dogman witness to ever reach out to me. I remember getting an email asking me if I could share a story and keep certain details to myself, which of course I promised. Then she sent me her encounter and I was like, damn, this has to be the scariest thing that I've ever read. This was way back in 2016, and all I had was this crappy little microphone from Guitar Hero and a little Samsung tablet that I could work on. But I was determined to make this one count, because obviously Dogman is my favorite thing to talk about on here. When I finally debuted the episode, Danielle Stedman messaged me and told me that I knocked it out of the park. And I think it was after that that I finally found my groove on this channel. At first, when I was recording, I would get nervous when I presented these stories to you. I'd post them and hope that I didn't sound like a big dummy, but after doing this episode, I think I found my confidence, and so this one's really special to me. Now, this poor woman went through one of the worst experiences with a dogman that I have ever read. I couldn't imagine being alone in the woods at night with not one, but two of these things hunting you. That amount of fear had to have been unbelievable. I just remember reading the email and going over to my best friend to show him. Now, he's more of a Scully than a Mulder, but after he read it, he said to me, dude, if this really happened, that's the craziest thing that I've ever heard. To this day, I haven't read many encounters that are scarier than this one, and that's saying something, because I read a lot of terrifying crap. Unfortunately for this case though, I'm having a hard time identifying whether or not it was dogmen or werewolves that she saw, because there isn't really any specific details about how the legs looked. And she's one of those witnesses that emailed me and then disappeared. Not disappeared as in we couldn't find her anymore, but just never got back to me. But my gut says it was probably dogmen that she encountered. I mean, it's Wisconsin after all, right? But this one also strikes pretty close to home, because I enjoy going camping alone. You'd think after reading all these things that happened during camping trips that it would be off the table for me, but at this point, camping is just part of who I am. Even worse though, when I was in California, I used to camp in the same area that Anthony Chaney saw a dogman. But anyways, here's the one that I've called Werewolf Woods since I first read it. I hope you enjoy hearing it as much as I like telling it. Dear Supernaturalist, I would like to begin by requesting that any details I give about my identity or the location of this encounter be kept private. Just thinking about writing this down is scaring me, and I'm typing now against my better judgment. But a very close friend of mine is urging me to share this horror story in hopes it might be some sort of cathartic experience. Along with my ever-present fear of what happened to me, I am also a high-ranking member of my profession and do not wish for my colleagues to hear about this and call my sanity into question. I will not share my name, nor will I share the exact location this happened to me, or what my previously mentioned profession is. I will share that I am a female. This happened to me in the early fall of 2002, September 26th to be precise, in Wisconsin. A friend of mine and I had planned on taking a long weekend and retreating out into the woods for a 5-day camping trip. The day before we were set to depart, my friend informed me that she was unable to make the first half of our trip due to a work conflict, though she would be joining me that Friday. Being the adventurous type and having already taken the time off, I thought it would be a fun excursion and a peaceful couple of days if I ventured out into the forest all by myself. Now, in case you're thinking that this is not quite a sensible idea, I have spent many a night in the forest from the time I was a young girl up until this last camping trip, which was about a month prior to these events. The anniversary of the darkest night is just around the corner, and I have yet to venture back into the woods. And that was 20 years ago. The morning of my camping trip, I awoke early, eager to get on the road. I had a 3-hour drive ahead of me. I loaded up my camping gear into my car and was on the road by 7:30 a.m. Around 11 o'clock, I finally made it through the twisting roads, parked, and hiked my way into the woods to get a good spot. To make things easier for my friend to find our spot, I tied blue ribbons to trees along the way. A cute idea, I thought, as our mutual favorite color was blue. About 20 minutes and 2 other potential spots later, I decided against those and found what I thought to be the perfect spot. I set up camp, made myself lunch, and enjoyed a hike, followed by a relaxing afternoon and a peaceful night in front of my campfire. That night, I retired to my tent earlier than I normally would have, but the drive and multiple hikes had worn me out. About 10 o'clock or so, I extinguished my campfire and crawled into my tent. Sometime that night, I awoke to what appeared to be a large something or other traipsing about my campsite. I'm embarrassed to have no way of knowing what time it was or how long that something or other was out there, since I refused to illuminate my Indiglo watch. It seemed like a long time that animal, or whatever it was snooping around outside, but admittedly, it could have been only mere minutes. Once the sounds faded into the distance, I listened for another several minutes, and finally sighed in relief that, whatever it was, had went back to where it had come from. And I fell asleep again. The next morning, I awoke, feeling foolish that I let my fear get the best of me, and I exited my tent to look for tracks. Unfortunately, I believe that the ground was just too hard to produce any type of viable tracks. I again enjoyed the peaceful serenity of the forest after that. The entire day was filled with doing whatever I wanted, and I found myself imagining what it would be like to just live out here. Little did I know that my perfect image of the forest and all that it would offer would soon be shattered. Forever. Without any hope of ever gaining it back. A few hours after sundown, I sat by my fire, enjoying a few chapters of City of Bones by Michael Conley. The first thing that struck me as odd was how quiet the forest was. The previous night, it was abuzz with many different animals and insects, but this night, it seemed the whole forest had been vacated. Only mere minutes before that, I could hear all sorts of things talking into the night. But like I said, now you could hear a pin drop. A rustling sound behind me alerted me to the presence of something close, and I spun around, peering into the dark forest, but saw nothing. That's when the most pungent smell I've ever had the misfortune of introducing my nostrils to wafted past me. The only thing I can compare it to is stale urine, combined with the smell of an old dog that had lived his entire life in his owner's backyard. Another noise to my right startled me so badly I nearly jumped from my skin. Having had enough of this, I grabbed my flashlight and aimed into the forest where I heard the second noise. What I saw still terrifies me to this day, 20 years later. No more than 50 feet from me did the beam of my flashlight land on the chest of a massive creature. I don't have words for it. And, to top it off, this thing was standing on 2 legs. Not 4, like a normal animal. 2, like a human. It was extremely muscular and extremely tall. I'm above average height for a woman at 6 foot tall, and this monster was towering over me. If I had to approximate its height, I would put it over 7 feet tall. It was jet black and had a canine-like head, which included a very large muzzle. And its eyes were a yellow amber color, which it used its hands to shield when my flashlight beam bounced off of its face. The hands, yes, hands, not paws, are the fuzziest in my memory, but if I recall correctly, they were almost a sickening combination of paw and hand. How I took in so much detail in the mere seconds I stared upon this creature is beyond me, but they're details that I will never, ever forget. Every muscle in my body was frozen, but every neuron in my brain was screaming to flee to my car. As I turned, I made another horrifying realization. This beast wasn't alone. Before me was yet another of these creatures, only this one was on all fours. It too had the yellow amber colored eyes and canine head. It too was jet black. It was stalking towards me as my back was turned, but froze when I cast my light onto it. Was this creature sneaking up on me while its partner was causing a fatal distraction? The creature that was on all fours stared up at me, its mouth open. Its mouth seemed to be full of huge, pointed teeth that could easily tear me to shreds. I was frozen in terror, my mind still trying to relate to me what I was even looking at. For all intents and purposes, I was standing in the middle of two huge werewolves. But surely these monsters can't exist, is what my brain was trying to tell me. However, there, right in front of me, were two allegedly fake movie monsters. I was sure I was going to be killed and eaten by this pair of monsters, my body never being found again, or my friend possibly following my ribbons into our campsite and finding the remnants of my carcass, maybe even suffering the same fate that I did. Remembering that you should never run away from a predator, I slowly began to back away from them. To my horror, the monster on all four legs took a step closer to me. I glanced over at his friend. It hadn't moved a muscle. I continued to back away, silently praying that there wasn't a third monster right behind me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The monster didn't move from where he was, so I backed away even more. Still, it stood motionless. At this point, I had succumbed to the most frightening amount of terror I have ever endured, and my flight instinct took over completely. I ran. However, I ran in the only direction I could, away from my car. The creature that was on all fours was blocking the path that I had used to get from my car to my site. I was cut off from the only means of escape that I had. For several moments, it sounded to me as if they were both chasing after me. I could hear heavy footfalls of the pair chasing after me. I could hear breathing and grunting and growling coming from behind me. The footfalls themselves made these things sound incredibly heavy. Still, having no idea what I was facing, I had no way of knowing how well these things could see in the dark. Were they nocturnal? How much of a disadvantage was I at? Was it going to be a quick death, or was I going to be eaten alive? The terror was overwhelming. As I ran, I sobbed, hoping that I wouldn't run out of breath from crying and sobbing and running for my life. I haven't the slightest idea how far or how long I ran, but at that point, my lungs were on fire, and the only thing I was managing to do was isolate myself even further into the woods. But still, I continued to run through the forest, tripping over miscellaneous forest obstacles as I tore through the woods in terror. I was trying my best to stifle my screams of fear, but I could not seem to get a grip on the tears that were flowing freely down my face. And then, I made a decision. I stopped running. And then, as if I were the central victim of a bad horror movie, I aimed a flashlight in the direction that I had just come from. I can remember the beam bouncing around as I shook uncontrollably. I held my breath and listened. All I could hear were the peaceful sounds of nature again, and this gave me some measure of calm. For the quietness that I experienced before was a sure sign, in my opinion, that the giant predators were present. Hopefully, because nature was talking into the night again, that was an indication that they had stopped giving chase. I remained still for the longest time and continued to listen, holding my hand over the light of my flashlight. I could feel the sting on my face and bare arms where the brush had scratched my skin. Now worried that the blood from my wounds would attract these things, I started to gasp for breath. It was one of those moments where terror had still taken over you, and even trying to breathe was difficult. I decided to myself that I was at a crossroads, and a decision had to be made. Should I keep running further into the woods and wait it out until morning? Or should I risk doubling back towards my car and possibly running right into these creatures again? I took a deep breath, prayed to God it wouldn't be my last, and gathered my courage for the run back towards my car. I silently patted myself on the back for always wearing my car key on a chain around my neck. I took one more moment to listen for anything heading my way, and then I sprinted back the way that I had just come. As I ran through the forest, I was suddenly very aware of the damage to my face and arms. They were taking a serious beating from the trees and bushes, but I pushed it out of my mind and continued to run. After what seemed like an eternity, I saw the light of my campfire and blew through my sight. I didn't take the opportunity to look around, but for the few brief seconds I was at my sight, no monsters were visible. The rest of my run was uneventful, yet still terrifying. As I ran, I couldn't help but think back to the previous day, where the hike into this once wonderful area was so peaceful. That calm had been shattered forever. I finally, and thankfully, made it to my car and wasted no time securing myself inside. I turned on the ignition and turned on the lights, half expecting to see one or both of the monsters standing in front of me. Thankfully, nothing was there, and I drove as fast as I could in the dark. Again, half expecting to see one of them standing in the middle of the road in front of me, or running out across the road to scare me into crashing. I drove straight home. By the time I arrived, it was nearly 4:30 in the morning. Even at this early hour, I called my friend and told her I'd returned home, and the camping trip was no longer happening. When she asked why, all I could say was I would fill her in on the details at another time. For 3 years, she was the only person I shared my story with. I still don't understand what I witnessed that ill-fated night. Like I mentioned previously, I still have not been back in the woods since then. I never returned to collect my belongings. I never finished City of Bones, because anytime I tried, all I could think about was that night. Until that night, I was firm in my opinion that Sasquatch and others like him were make-believe. What I saw, though, changed the way that I look at the world. These creatures are definitely out there. The fact that the first creature that I encountered seemed to be causing a distraction for the other to sneak up on me gives whatever they are a measure of intelligence I wouldn't expect to find in a mere animal. Not to mention how terrified I am when I think about how if I hadn't turned around, that creature could have pounced on me, and I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. What exactly were these creatures I encountered? With the possibility of being laughed at, I still believe it had to have been a pair of werewolves, or this dogman creature that everybody talks about. Whether these are monsters that are men in the daylight, or if they simply have these things somewhere, someplace, and they find campsites and attack people, doesn't affect my opinion. I do know one thing. The moon was not full that night. The other moment of my encounter that still gives me chills was the fact that this creature had the intelligence to put its claw up to its eyes to shield the flashlight beam. This reaction just gave him an almost human quality, or at least a human intelligence. And the way that paw or claw or hand looked signifies to me that this was not just an animal. This is something that science hasn't discovered yet, or something that science is keeping hidden from us. Moreover, why did they cease their chase? I doubt I outran them. Why did they decide I wouldn't make a satisfying dinner? Did they ever intend to harm me at all? Were they simply chasing me off of their territory? Did they decide that I wasn't worth the chase because I wouldn't give them the energy that they required? These questions I will have for the rest of my life. Thank you for relaying my encounter to those that have a true interest in hearing what people like myself have to say. I'm positive you will do this story justice. In closing, I do know that there are people out there that are desperate to have encounters of their own with these creatures. I beg you, stay out of the woods at night. Don't go looking for these monsters. For all you know, they could kill you. Sincerely, Anonymous. Now, the story of Old Jim is a favorite of mine because it reminds me so much of my grandpa, or Pop, as I call him. Pop passed away in 2011, but I still have the greatest memories of him. And we actually share the same birthday, so that was always a special thing that we did together. Pop really was the best, and he was also tough as nails, just like Old Jim was in this encounter. So to me, this encounter holds a special place in my heart because I think of Pop when I read it. And it's pretty detailed of an experience too. The fact that this man saw what he did and refused to give up his home and go somewhere else is a testament to how tough Old Jim really was. If someone told me that a dogman was standing there in the cornrows watching them, just staring at the place, and then I heard the damn thing walking around on the roof, you best believe I'd be grabbing my kid, our Toy Story toy collection, and my autographed picture of Tara Lipinski and getting the hell out of that thing's way. But not Old Jim. Old Jim said, "Hell with that. This is where I lived with my wife, and ain't no fuzzy-ass werewolf gonna change that." And then there is the fact that this thing was up on the roof. I've heard this so many times now that it just seems like it's something that they always do, even though I still can't figure out exactly why. But I do have a theory. I think they try to use it as a way to draw people out. I saw this nature show once where these foxes did the same thing to rabbits. They leapt up and down near their burrows as a way to scare them out. Now, I'm not saying that Dogman really has canine DNA, but if they do, maybe it's something that both of these canids learned a long time ago. Who knows? But it's not something that I ever want to find out firsthand. So here's another encounter from Wisconsin. The story of Old Jim, who was tough as nails. I've lived in Wisconsin my entire life, and pretty close to Elkhorn too. Close enough to have heard the stories of the Beast of Bray Road. In the 48 years of my life, I never believed it one single time, until the day that I was made a believer. I used to spend a lot of time at my girlfriend's father's house. Once his wife passed away, he was just so lonely. I've never seen a man that lonely. So my girlfriend and I would just go over and spend time with him. He had this cornfield on the back of his property. It wasn't a big one at all. I think it was more of a hobby for him anyways. But regardless, he'd go out there and he'd work on that corn, grow it and sell it, and use the money to restore this 1959 Chevy Bel Air. That's a good looking car, even to this day. But anyways, he had this scarecrow out there. It wasn't scary by any means. In fact, I thought it was the stupidest thing that I'd ever seen. It was still creepy though, just because it was this humanoid figure that was hanging up on a big piece of wood, watching over the corn. I know it's pretty cliche to have one out there, but he'd made it with his late wife and swore it protected the fields from the crows, so we never said anything about it. For as much time as we spent over at his place, I spent just as much time out on the patio. I'd watch the sunrise and the sunset, and I'd watch that cornfield. There was just something about it that I didn't like. Maybe I'd seen signs too many times and I was waiting for crop circles to appear or something. Or maybe it was just that damn scarecrow. But either way, Something about that field just made me uneasy. Until one day, it made me damn near terrified. I remember sitting out on the porch, and I just gazed up quickly at the cornfield and looked back down at my book. I thought to myself, hey, Jim moved that stupid scarecrow. But then I immediately looked up and took another glance. It wasn't the scarecrow at all. It was the damn beast of Bray Road, right there in the flesh. What I looked at first was the back of this massive head. His back and shoulders were just as big. He was a dark brown color, as dark of a brown as you can get without being black. He was moving back and forth through the corn, like maybe he was looking for something, or maybe he was just wandering. I don't know. What I do know is I sat there and watched this creature, mouth hanging open wide in shock. My book fell right out of my hands and landed on the ground. I didn't even know what to do or what to say. All of a sudden, I guess this thing caught my whiff or heard my heart pounding or something. I don't know, but either way, it's like this thing sensed that I was there, and it turned around and looked right at me. At the time, that corn was about 7 feet tall, and that thing was about 2 feet taller than that. Again, I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run into the house and scream, but I knew there were 2 lives in that house that depended on me. I needed to get in there and warn them about what I was looking at, but at the same time, my legs felt like jelly. I wasn't moving anywhere. Then this thing just slowly turned around, back to whatever it was doing. Then after that, like it didn't have a care in the world, it just slowly walked off through the corn and I lost sight of it. I just sat there, watching in the direction that it walked off, my body still absolutely trembling. I still didn't know what the hell to even do. And then it was like my brain finally kicked back on. My neurons fired up or something. I slowly got up and walked back into the house. When the other 2 saw me, Debbie said I was as pale could be. I sat down on the couch just trying to figure out what I was going to tell them. How could I tell them that the beast of Bray Road was just in the cornfield right outside of their house, and that all the stories we've ever heard our entire lives were probably all true? All I could ask for was a glass of water. Honestly, I think I was in shock. At this point, I could tell that they were both worried about me, so I told them everything that I just saw. After that, all 3 of us just sat in silence for a long time, none of us saying a single word. My mind was still trying to accept what I saw. I didn't know if the 2 of them were trying to come to terms with that, or if they were trying to figure out how to tell me I was the biggest liar in the world, or maybe the craziest person that they've ever met. Then Jim finally broke the silence. What do you think it wants? I just shook my head and looked at him. I don't know, Jim. Then he looked me in the eye, like he just accepted everything I just told him, and he said, "Will you please make sure Debbie gets home safely tonight?" There was this quiver in his voice, like he was scared but also calm at the same time. It was weird. It was like he just accepted the fact that this thing could come back, could kill him even, and he was okay with it. He just wanted to make sure that his daughter was safe. Like, if he did die, he'd be with his wife again, but he would die knowing that his daughter was still okay. But Deb didn't want to hear anything of the sort, and she went over to him and sat down next to him, grabbing his arm. She said we weren't leaving him alone. I finally shook off that cloud in my head and agreed with her. I told him he wasn't staying at the house alone. He was coming back to our place with us. But, being the stubborn old man that we love, he just shook his head at me and said he wasn't going anywhere. And you know what? At that moment, I knew there was nothing I could do to change his mind. He looked back at Debbie and told her, and I remember this word for some reason. "Debbie, this was your mom's house. I can still see her everywhere I look. I can feel her all over the whole property. I'm not giving this house up. And then Deb moved her hand from his arm to his hand and told him we weren't leaving him alone. If he was staying, then we were too. And I guess good old Jim knew that Deb got her stubbornness from him, and he just nodded, accepting it. Looks like we're all staying in a house that might as well have been a to-go box as far as I was concerned. Jim said nobody was going outside then, something I was perfectly fine with. I had no intentions of wandering around outside after seeing what I did, especially after the sun went down. Debbie was the only one that slept that night. I remember lying there on my back in the bed next to her, still thinking about what I saw, trying to comprehend that there's more out there than we can accept as an educated human being. But what else was I thinking about? It was, if all these stories of the beasts of Bray Road were true, then what the hell else is out there too? Sasquatch, aliens, haunted houses? Because now I was sure as hell a believer in Dogman. So I think, at some point, I had accepted that other things might need to be believed in too. It was 2:18 in the morning when I heard the footsteps on the roof that night. They were loud and heavy. Thing is though, I didn't hear nothing climb up there. I didn't hear anything land up there as if it had leapt up there. They sounded heavier than what I would make if it were me walking around. I knew it wasn't a bird or anything. It was that monster again. That fear was like nothing that I can explain. I shook Debbie and whispered her name, but she whispered back to me, "I'm awake. I hear it too." It didn't go on for long. Maybe 5 minutes or so, but it was enough to send all of us out into the hallway, huddling together, listening to whatever was up there walking around on the damn roof. It stopped for a minute, like maybe it was listening to us too. We were whispering in hushed voices about what to do, and we decided it best to just stay right there and be quiet. When this thing started up again, it sounded like it walked all the way down the roof to the other side of the house, turned around and walked all the way back. It wasn't continuous either. It would take a few steps, pause, and then take a couple more after a few seconds. After those 5 minutes or so, they stopped altogether. I didn't hear it moving around anymore, but we sure as hell didn't go to bed. We stayed up and listened, trying to figure out if it was still there. Now, call me crazy, but I really don't think it was a coincidence that on the same day I see a dogman moving around on our property, that something else that sounded just as big as that damn thing was walking around on the friggin' roof. I think it was the same damn thing. I think the dogman that I saw in the cornfield was the same thing walking around on the roof that night. Now, Jim and Deb had never seen it there before. Maybe this creature was just passing through. Maybe it was staking out its new territory. Maybe it was lost and just trying to figure out where to go. Maybe it wanted to see if we were a threat or easy prey. All of these things were flying through my mind the rest of the night. I didn't sleep a wink. Neither did Debbie or Jim. We just sat there, quiet, listening. None of us spoke the rest of the night. We just sat there and stared off into space, clutching the rifles that Jim had at his house. I'm sure the two of them were thinking about that thing just as much as me. I wanted to ask them what was on their minds, but I didn't want to break the silence. I think we all needed to be quiet to listen to that thing, just to make sure that it wasn't coming in. When morning finally came, it was me that went out to make sure everything was okay. I was so scared, I couldn't feel my lips. I know that's a weird thing to experience, but I remember it perfectly. I was so scared that my damn lips were numb. I burst through that front door and spun around to look at the roof. I wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything up there that was going to pounce on me or grab me and pull me up there to eat me. I ran around the house looking at the roof, rifle in my hand, but I didn't see anything. What I did see though was a broken tree. It was a little sapling, so not a big tree by any means, but it looked like something big had either ran into it and broke it or grabbed it and snapped it in half to get it out of its way. It was lying on the ground, just broken in half there. I went back inside and said the coast was clear, and I suggested to Jim that maybe we should get out of there for a couple of days and he can spend some time at our place. I think everything we experienced that last night rattled him. He was quiet and kind of shaky and just nodded his head at me. "I'll grab some things," he told me. As he walked into his room, he stopped and turned back to look at me. And in true Jim fashion, he told me it was only going to be for a couple of days, and after that, he was coming back home. "Ain't nothing running me off my home," he said. I couldn't help but smile at him. Even with the terror of the day before, he was still just as stubborn as he'd always been. They don't build them like they used to, do they? Tough as nails like him. I really admired the toughness he had, and the courage he was keeping up for his daughter's sake. Even as a grown woman, he still felt the need to teach her lessons and how to go through life. We drove to our place and stayed there for a few days. Deb and I both used some sick time to stay at home with Jim and keep him company. We talked about what we had experienced, but after a few days it just seemed to, fade away. It faded off like it was some kind of scary dream we all shared. I kept thinking about it, but I tried to push it out of my mind as best as I could. I knew what we saw and I'd accepted it, so why dwell on it? I wanted to be just as tough and fearless as Jim was being. After those few days were up, I guess Jim got homesick or stir-crazy and said he was going home. Debbie told him to be careful, and he said he'd call and check in frequently. He promised we didn't have anything to worry about and that he wasn't doing anything stupid. And he was right. For a year and a half, nothing happened. We didn't experience anything again like that night. No dogman, nothing on the roof, no broken trees. But then, one day, we found Jim out in his cornfield, stiff as a board. The autopsy showed that he suffered a major heart attack. I don't know if it had anything to do with the dogman, or if it was just his time to go. What I do know is that we found him in almost the exact same area that I saw the beast of Bray Road that night. That could have been a coincidence, I guess, but after seeing what I did and experiencing what all three of us did, I have a hard time believing that anything is a coincidence anymore. Debbie and I married 7 years ago now, and we made sure that the ashes of both of her parents were there. Jim was really an inspiration to me. I have a tattoo across my heart that matches the same inscription I made sure that we had engraved on his urn. Tough as nails. I want to thank you for sharing our story, and I hope I never have to share another one with you again. I'm not sure what it is about this encounter that I love so much, but it's another one that I like telling over a good campfire. Maybe it's the way that they're just going about some mundane chores right before the world is turned upside down, or maybe it's just how I can picture it all unfolding. But this one holds a special place for me. When I read it or tell the story, I can actually picture the barn and the loft in my mind, and I can picture them seeing this horrific creature looking right into their eyes before it pounces on them and chases them back to the house. I also like the fact that a husband and wife work together to make sure that each other don't get eaten. I don't know how many of you have watched the movie Dog Soldiers, but in my opinion, it's the greatest werewolf movie ever made. In it, there's this scene where a werewolf is coming through a window, and the first time I read this encounter, that's exactly what I thought of. When this witness talks about seeing it halfway through the window in the loft, that werewolf in that movie is what I pictured. Now these werewolves in Dog Soldiers are bitchin'. I personally think they're the coolest looking werewolf of any movie that I've ever seen. If you haven't watched it, imagine what a minotaur looks like, and then replace the bull characteristics with a wolf. They're badass. Also, if you haven't seen it, go watch it. once this episode's over. All in all, the story of the Dogman and the Loft is a good tale to tell. And if you like it, go tell it yourself over a campfire. Nobody's going to be disappointed. I live in South Minnesota, on private property in farm country. My property is rather large and heavily wooded in most parts of it. There's also a small pond and a steep stream bed on our property. It was the beginning of November when I had my encounter with this monster. My wife and I had just finished cleaning up our yearly Halloween party. We had invited the entire family out and set up the haunted trail that the younger people in the family could enjoy. It was 2 days after the party. It was about 9 p.m. We'd finally finished storing all of the decorations, and we also moved our 5 horses up to the main barn from their lockout pasture. We'd put them down there so we could use the main pasture for the trail. The horses didn't make it very easy though, and they bolted as soon as we opened their gate. This wasn't usually like them. We basically had to run up a hill about a mile to catch up, and then we just set out fresh hay and locked them in since there was going to be a hard freeze that night. I was just putting dinner in and was enjoying the television when my phone got a text message in the kitchen. I lazily got to my feet when I heard the horses going crazy again in the barn, and I figured one of the farm dogs had gotten locked in with them. I mean, they do prefer to sleep in the hay instead of our carpet in the house. So I grabbed my spotlight and I walked out to the porch. Surprisingly though, I found all of the dogs there, and they were all staring at the barn too. I shine the light down on the lockout pasture, and I see the horses only on one side. They're all staring at the open barn door too. At this point, I'm still assuming they'd been spooked by something small. Maybe a bat was flying around, or perhaps a tool fell off the wall. They were spooked easily. I called back to my wife, who was upstairs, that something spooked the horses, and told her I was going to go round them up, and asked her for help. It took her a minute to reply, and she told me that she'd be out in a few. I called for the dogs to come with me, and then I started for the barn. I walked into the barn, and then looked at the horses, immediately trying to crowd around me. I mean, they were so eager to see me, they almost pushed me over. I yelled, and they backed off, giving me some space. Then I see my wife's mare, named Cherry, and she kept rubbing her muzzle against me. Her eyes were wide, and she was terrified. I grabbed the stool that was nearby, and I began to brush her hair, and patting her backside. This was something that she enjoyed, and I was just trying to calm her down. But that's when I noticed these 4 long, parallel slashes going down her leg. I immediately thought there was a bear, and I started shining my flashlight into the barn. Besides a few tools and some buckets that were thrown about, there was nothing. I figured if there was a bear, it had smelled some of the garbage left in the upper level of the party. I was just about to start walking the horses back up when I noticed a bale of hay lying on the floor, and the twine was still on it. That wasn't there when I locked them up. At this point, I went rigid, and I shined my flashlight up into the loft, expecting to see a black bear. But I could only see the first couple of feet up the loft. I had to climb up to see any further. I walked over to the ladder and noticed some dark gray hair hanging on a nail about halfway up. Right before I was about to climb up, I hear my wife start screaming from behind me. These terrified, blood-curdling screams, and the horses all start whining too. I look around to her, and she's shining her own light up towards the barn loft, and she yelled at me to look up at the window. I climbed up the ladder and took a look towards the window, and it wasn't a bear. At first, I thought it was one of the younger relatives that we had pulling a prank on me, but then this creature opened its mouth and started to pant like a dog, and I knew that this was no prank. It was about 6 feet tall, maybe a little more, and at least 200 pounds. It was halfway through the window to the barn loft. It was a dark gray color with a lighter shade of gray around its neck. Its head was very similar to a German Shepherd, but with a much larger muzzle. And its eyes, the closest thing I can describe them as would be the color of beer, but like when someone was shining a dull yellow light through it. And those eyes, they were locked right on me, and its mouth was still open, revealing these sharp, jagged teeth. I remember they were stained brown. It was almost like it was leaning on the window with one hand resting on its side. Its hands looked like raccoon hands to me. It had long, bony fingers and long, sharp claws. I was terrified. I slowly went down the ladder and made my way over to my wife. There, we could still see this thing, just staring at us and panting. But now, it was on the other side of the window. My wife was about to scream again, but I clasped my hand over her mouth. She immediately grabbed my arm and clung to me. I mean, the terror that we were both feeling was just overwhelming. That creature put both hands on the window while it leaned down, and I whispered to my wife, "On 3, we run and we don't look back." Before I could finish the sentence, though, that creature jumped down and went on all fours, growling at us, looking like it was ready to charge. We took off. We ran the 25-yard gap between the house and the barn in record time. The dogs were all running to the deck in front of us. They seemed just as terrified. We could hear growling from that thing behind us, and as the dogs got there first, they spun around and started growling and baring their teeth at that thing. I didn't dare turn around at this point. I just wanted to make sure that my wife and I got to the house safely, because I knew this thing could destroy us if it caught us. With those teeth and those claws, we would be easy prey. My wife reached the door first, and she flung it open. When she turned to me, she screamed again, and finally, I risked looking back. This thing was so close to me, it had to be less than 10 feet. I reached the foot of the steps and jumped as hard and as far as I could. Thankfully, I landed inside with the dogs right behind me, and my wife slammed the door shut. It was then, though, that I looked up and saw her flung backwards as the door was slammed into by that thing. It stood back up on 2 legs and stared down at us, baring those horrible teeth again. It wasn't all the way in, though. I jumped up and I placed all my weight onto that door. It was barely open and I slammed it shut. I felt something heavy slamming its weight against the door, though. I heard the wood begin to crack, but luckily my wife recovered and rushed to my side to help me shut the door and put the lock in place. Then we ran through the entryway, both screaming in terror, and locked every door that we passed by on the way to the kitchen. You see, the only window in the kitchen was a small one right above the sink. We hid under the sink, hopefully out of sight of that thing. We huddled there for about 3 hours, waiting and listening. Each one of our dogs seemed to be set at a different entryway in the living room, all observant, all waiting as well. We heard each one growling one after the other, like something was outside, stalking around the house. Not too long after that, we heard the horses whining, followed by some loud crash. I figured they'd broke down the gate and escaped back into the pasture. Or, at least I hoped they did, because I didn't want my poor horses ripped apart by that thing either. But I was too scared to go out there and do anything. I felt relief until one of the dogs started baring its teeth a moment later, and the assault on our house continued. Eventually, though, around midnight, things seemed to start to settle down. The dogs weren't growling anymore or baring their teeth. We snuck into the bedroom, shut all the curtains, and locked the doors. We tried to get some sleep. I know that sounds crazy, but I guess all that adrenaline, once it wore off, it was just exhausting. But even as tired as we were, every little sound made us jump. My wife was still worried about the horses, and just as the sun began to rise, we managed to fall asleep. When we woke up, we immediately got dressed and went to check on the horses. Thank God they were all fine. I mean, still scared witless, but fine. We patched up Cherry with the deep gashes on her leg, and we went over to the barn door to see what needed fixing. What we saw surprised us, and still to this day unnerves me, because the latch on the barn door had been undone and flipped up the way a person would do it. It wasn't broken through like an animal would do. No animal I know would open up a latch like that, so what the hell was that thing? The only term I could think of would be werewolf. because that's exactly what it looked like. I realized this thing, whatever it was, had to be extremely intelligent, and that just made it all the more horrifying to me. That day we went into town and got a deadbolt for the barn. We went to a sporting goods store and bought a gun, too. After that night, we didn't have any more encounters, unless you count the horses refusing to leave the barn a few weeks later. I asked my nearby neighbors if anything strange had happened to them on their properties, and all but one said no. It was our neighbor that lived a few miles south of our property, and he told me they lost a stallion a few weeks prior to my encounter. I asked if he saw anything, and he gave me this really funny look. He said it looked like a bear got to the stallion really bad. It tore the stallion up pretty good, too. The way he looked at me, though, it was like he knew something, and I wondered if he was hiding something, like a story that nobody would believe, maybe. I didn't push the subject, though. I mean, I didn't really want to talk about it any further. Since then, I can't look out at the woods the same way anymore. If things like that are out there, then who knows what else is. I don't feel safe going fishing, camping, or even horseback riding anymore. I will say this to you, though. If you're outside at night, always watch your back. Trust your instincts and the reactions of your animals, because they're the ones that told me that something was wrong in the first place. I really think what I encountered was a werewolf that night. I just don't have any other explanation for what it could be. It was almost man-sized. It wasn't too tall. I didn't see a tail. The way it looked at me just made me think it knew who I was or something. That it realized what it could do to me. And then it had this level of intelligence, like wild animals just don't have. It was almost like it was self-aware. And even like it knew what it was capable of. Any insight on this would be nice, because honestly I'm just curious to know what it was that we encountered. And I sure hope that we never encounter anything like this ever again. Because that amount of terror that we felt that night was something that you can't even comprehend unless you see something like this up close. I pray for everyone out there listening that they never have an encounter like this of their own, because you might not be as lucky as my wife and I. If it wasn't for the two of us working together and shutting that door and locking it, if it wasn't for my wife seeing that thing before I got up into the loft, we might not even be here to tell you that story today. I thank God every day that we got out of that encounter alive, and I pray that if anybody else has an encounter with that thing or something like it, then they're lucky enough to get out of there too. Blake's encounter. The Texas werewolves. What can I say about this one? You know, I like to keep in contact with my witnesses, which isn't always an easy feat. Some of them send me stories and I never hear from them again. Some of them send me stories under false names and I never knew who they are. And that's just to keep the real names and locations a secret, which is totally fine with me. But on rare occasions, I actually get to keep in contact with them. Rarer still is when I actually get to form a friendship with them. Blake here is the one witness I have formed the strongest bond with. He isn't just someone that sent me a story anymore. He's my friend. I've had the privilege to know him for a long time now. We talk on Facebook all the time. I believe every word he says. He has no other reason to seek people out to share his story with other than to get the truth out there. Blake is an accomplished writer. He's a musician. He's a devoted father and a husband. And he's my friend. When I first heard his story, it was actually on another channel, but I can't remember which one it was at this point. But then a few months later, he actually contacted me. He emailed me his encounter, and I was floored by how close he was to what I thought at the time was a dogman. Now this was only a year or so into my channel being up, and I had no idea what other entities were out there stalking through the forest. Now I know there's a difference between a werewolf and a dogman. From his experiences and the stories from his grandfather, it seems like this type of werewolf might actually have the ability to switch back and forth, which is why the one that Blake saw first had the clothes on. and I think Blake can agree with that. But anyways, I promptly responded to him because I was so excited to work with him. And then we worked together to carve out this intricate picture for all of the creatures of the night to listen to. I've heard him talk about this one in first person. I know how scared he was every time he encountered one of these things. And there's multiple times that he saw it. I hope my presentation relates that terror to you. Thanks for trusting me to share this story, Blake, and for all the years of our friendship. But honestly, I hope I never have to present another encounter from you again. So here are Blake's numerous encounters, and I hope you enjoy them. Chances are you've heard my story. Chances are you've doubted it too. There's a good chance you think I'm crazy. If it were only that simple. If only these experiences that most people feel the need to cast ridiculing opinions on were just a fabrication made simply for your entertainment. That isn't the case. At least not mine. I'll start off with a little background. My name is Blake Hill. I'm 30 years old. I've lived a lot of life too. I have 4 daughters and 1 son. I almost reached fame as a musician and gave it up foolishly. I'm trying to rebuild that. I'm divorced. Sometimes I feel as if these events caused a chain reaction that have ruined my chances to have a normal life. But I refuse to be that cynical. I'm a local truck driver in Houston, delivering lumber to mostly new residential construction sites. I'm a quarter Native American. I won't name my tribe out of respect for my people, though. I'm the oldest of my great-grandfather's 48 great-grandchildren, which means I've learned a lot of our history, a lot of our secrets, and the legends that only my tribe's elders can tell you. Anyway, my first experience was on the 20th of July in 2012. It was a Friday night. I was 19 at the time, and I didn't have many responsibilities other than delivering pizza part-time. So naturally, being a teenager, I was out with friends at a house party in Old Katy, which is a suburb west of Houston, Texas. My friends and I experimented both with marijuana and alcohol, but we were always responsible enough to make sure one of us stayed sober to be the designated driver. That particular night was my turn to be the sober one. My friend Brennan had gotten well past drunk, and once he was starting to behave recklessly, I decided it was time to leave the party and take him home. He didn't want me to take him home, so instead he asked me to drive him to one of his friends' houses that I'm not really familiar with. This friend, who I only remember as Joey, lived on the far east outskirts of Katy. I took a road called Morton Road to get there. We rode with the driver and passenger windows down so Brennan could get some fresh air. The street is one turn off of Morton, called Bartlett. My sense of direction is fairly superior. I delivered pizzas all throughout Katy, and have since become a local truck driver in Houston. Bartlett had 3 or 4 houses on the right side, and on the west side was a fairly large forest area, maybe 40 acres or so, and it dead ends just past the last house. I noticed the moon was full before I even went out that night, and vaguely noted it as I got to Joey's house, which was the second house on the right. I parked my car on the left-hand side of the road, closest to the trees, and I helped Brennan get out of the car. I walked him to the porch and Joey came out. He thanked me for dropping him off and we said goodbye. I decided to smoke a cigarette before I left the road. At the time, I shared the car with my dad, and his number 1 rule was not to smoke in the car. After lighting my cigarette, it didn't take long to notice the road was eerily silent. I assume I didn't notice it before as I was helping my noisy drunk friend get inside the house. But maybe 3 drags into my cigarette, I hear these heavy footsteps going across the gravel, maybe 100 feet in front of me. I was alarmed by the sound they made, familiar to the sound of someone pulling something metal against concrete. That's what that sounded like. Now, just so we're clear, my fears have always been werewolves. I've always been into horror movies. I love scaring myself, but the only monster to pop into my dreams have been werewolves. So here I am, alone, standing on a dark road under a full moon, and I hear something big walking too close for comfort right in front of me. I didn't hesitate to throw down my cigarette and get into the car. I told myself, as I was getting in, that I wouldn't turn on my headlights so I wouldn't have to see what was in front of me, and simply reverse my way back onto Morton Road and then get the hell out of there. Unfortunately for me, my car had automatic lights that turned on as soon as I started the car, a fact that I was aware of but, in my panicked state, just seemed to ignore. Immediately in front of me, about 100 feet as I had guessed, was a 6.5 to 7 foot tall beast on 2 legs. It was covered in black fur, with the body of a gym-addicted man and the head of what I guess could be similar to a German shepherd or even a black wolf. It had human-like feet that were covered in that dark fur as well, and it had claws sticking out about 2 inches, and it held its left hand out the same way a human would, reaching for something in front of him. I noticed that the fingers ended in large claws, just like the feet did. Well, this was enough to cause my jaw to drop. What got me the most? It was wearing torn blue jeans that seemed too tight and unnaturally torn, and an open flannel blue shirt that was ripped at its bulky shoulders. It looked my way when the lights revealed it and glared at me with narrowed yellow eyes and bared its large fangs. My windows were still down, and I hadn't touched my radio, so I had no trouble hearing that loud growl. It then turned its head to the forest, dropped on all fours, and ran out of sight into the trees. All this took place within about 20 seconds, but it felt like hours. At this point, I literally had tears in my eyes, but I didn't hesitate for 1 second longer to shove my car in reverse and put the gas pedal to the metal. I heard loud growling and grunting as I was leaving. I reversed onto Morton Road and went 80 to 90 miles an hour down the streets leading back to Katy, and I didn't slow down until I was on Interstate 10. While still on Morton Road, I kept my eyes in front of me and sobbed the whole time, because I'd never been so scared in my entire life. I can swear that the look I got from this creature was communicating to me that I had no business seeing him, and he wanted me gone. The look reminded me of criminals on TV being caught for their wrongdoings and wanting to cause harm to those who witnessed it. I got home, I ran inside and called my Scottish Terrier into my room, and I didn't sleep until the sun was up. To this day, I've never had a desire, nor the nerve to go back to that part of Morton Road. I obsessed over the idea that I had seen a werewolf and researched werewolf sightings on Google, and was intrigued by the Beast of Bray Road and the Michigan Dogman. Their sightings from decades before this. Everything else that came up also fascinated me. But I was disappointed to see that nothing I found on the web was precisely what I saw. While the beasts that others have encountered seem similar, none were spotted wearing clothes. I told my mother and father what I had seen, and while my mother could tell I was being genuine, my father was more interested in me driving that far from home without letting him know, so I stopped talking about it. Of the few people outside of my family I've told, most responded with, "Did you ask the werewolf if he got the vampires yet?" or similarly stupid things like that. It wasn't hard to notice that my story sounded far-fetched, especially considering the fact that I couldn't find any other reported sightings near the Houston area, nor much in Texas either recently. I never submitted my encounter online because I was scared of being ridiculed, or to be honest, scared that if I did say my story that somehow that creature would find out and hunt me down. I'm honestly positive I'll never stop being haunted by the memory of this creature. It's just too vivid and too frightening to put out of my mind. I've also never told Brennan, the friend I dropped off there that night. I didn't tell him what I saw. In fact, I didn't see him again for 2 years until accidentally bumping into him at a gas station. My grandmother even took an interest in my encounter and told me the legend of our tribe's skinwalkers and the cursed enemies, which is very interesting and disturbing all at once. I'm not able to give much detail out of respect for my tribe, but I'll say this. Our skinwalkers are very different than the Navajo tribe's tales. They would transform into either bears or wolves when wars would break out. Once the leader of their enemies were caught, the skinwolf, which is our nickname for these things, would bite and infect them, damning them to become a half-wolf monster on the full moon, similar to most werewolf legends. Our ancestor spirits are most powerful and prominent during the full moon, and it's them who would force our enemies into their transformation. The curse would be passed down for every eldest male of each new generation of the cursed enemy's descendants. These cursed ones vowed revenge on my people, but it started out as an empty threat. Our ancestor spirits who control the curse don't allow them to hurt us. The reason I say it started as an empty threat is because we descendants are no longer pure blood, and neither are most people that we've started families with. I normally would call bullshit on all of this, or say it's just a scary story, but after the night of my sighting and what followed 4 years later, let's just say I have an open mind. Then in the summer of 2016, my mom went shopping at Barnes & Noble and noticed a book by an author who was a cryptozoologist, and who I followed on social media in case of hearing anything similar to my experience. She saw it and thought I'd like it. I couldn't put it down, and after reading a chapter where a woman in Tennessee saw a clothed creature just like mine, I decided that after 4 years of hesitating, it was time to write to her. She believed my story, and she told me about a lot of other people reporting things similar to mine. I let her in on my tribe's legends to give both of us an angle we hadn't considered as far as learning what this creature actually is. I never got the chance to discuss the events that unfolded after foolishly going public with all of this to her. And my horror wasn't over. On September 16th of 2016, I was delivering lumber to a new neighborhood in Katy, right near Bartlett Road. The way it's set up is you've got Avenue D and Bartlett Road running parallel to each other, with Franz Road cut off connecting them in between, which is where I was en route to a new developing neighborhood and blew out my tire. My work truck doesn't come with a spare, so I had to call my boss to send over a service truck. That way I could get my tire replaced. All I could do after that was wait. I smoked about 3 cigarettes while writing lyrics when a truck came down the darkening road. I assumed it was the tire guy, but the truck was an 1998 Ford F-150, red, with a single cab. The truck slowed as it came by my truck, and the man in the cab rolled his window down. I didn't pay much attention to him, but I looked up in his direction. His face was hidden, but in a rougher, quiet voice he asked, "Hey bud, is everything alright? Anything I can help you with?" I said, "I got a service truck due here in about 5 minutes from now to fix my tire. I really appreciate your concern and courtesy though, thank you again." The man turned his head sharply towards me and sniffed the air, then smiled, revealing very yellow teeth, with canines that honestly looked like vampire fangs to me. What freaked me out the most was that this son of a bitch was wearing a blue flannel shirt with patches at the shoulders. The werewolf I saw had a torn blue flannel shirt on. Now, something else that you should know about me is I don't believe in a coincidence. Not after everything that I've seen. My eyes went wide in shock, and this guy's smile grew more sinister as he said, "I remember you." I asked what he was talking about. He said, "I remember you," in this loud growl. It sounded demonic. His eyes, I shit you not, turned yellow. The truck driver came down the road at that moment, and the man looked annoyed, but still very satisfied with himself. He looked at me, his eyes normal again, and his teeth just as yellow, but not sharp. And he said, "I'll see you around, Blake." Right then and there, I almost pissed myself. How did he know my name? "Screw you, you monster." I breathed barely audible to myself. But this guy was already pulling away. I got his license plate, but I didn't call it in. I mean, what the hell do you say to the cops? "Oh yeah, this dude just drove by and freaked me out. Also, I think he's a werewolf because he had the same shirt on as the werewolf I saw 4 years ago." Honestly, that just wasn't an option. What freaked me out even more was that I looked nothing like I did in 2012. I had a much more professional hairstyle, a tattoo sleeve, and about 100-pound weight loss. It's like this guy knew my scent or something. And then my third encounter happened. This one was the first that I believe was a dogman. It took place 1 week after the night the man and I had our encounter on Friends Road. My ex-wife's grandma had passed away, and that night was her viewing. It took place in Baytown, east of Houston. After the viewing, my ex, my second daughter, and myself went to her grandpa's house for a couple hours. He lives in East Houston, locally referred to as North Shore. My ex and I spent our early childhoods on North Shore, and as we were making the hour-long drive home to Katy, we began reminiscing on our memories of that North Shore. I ended up showing her the house I grew up in, and then passed by my great-grandmother's house, a street over. At that point, I had started to joke to her about going to look for the Channelview Goatman, which is an urban legend my mom told me about after discussing my encounter a few days before. She was laughing and saying, hell no, as anyone in our situation would, right? Now I'll point out that this area is old and rather run down, so there's no streetlights. I drove a 14-year-old Chevy Silverado with big mud grapplers at the time, so I had fairly decent vision of the road in front of me, but couldn't see the houses or driveways too well. As the road started to curve, I slowed to about 20 miles per hour, and I noticed a big black shadow in the darkness of the driveway that just stood out to me. It was barely noticeable, but I slowed down a little and turned my head towards it. I looked over to my ex, and her eyes were focused on it too, and she said, "What in the hell is that?" And that's when it charged my truck with an ungodly roar that made every hair on my body stand up. This thing shook the entire truck when it roared, and caused my infant daughter to wake up and start crying. It was running impossibly fast, and it was also on 2 legs, just like the werewolf that I saw. It was covered in black fur, with the head of a giant German shepherd, and weird backwards-like dog legs. Its eyes were yellow too, but I swear they were full of evil and rage. Without any hesitation, I stomped on the gas pedal, and the Chevy tore off like a bat out of hell. We were going about 70 miles per hour down this sharp, winding residential street, lights from the surrounding houses coming on as I went. We were silent for about 15 minutes until we passed downtown Houston. "It was just a dog, right?" my ex asked me nervously. She knew of my past encounters, and I noticed her glance at the full moon. "I don't think so," I told her, exhausted. I told my grandmother what happened that same night, and she stared into my face with a horrified expression and told me something else that I never knew. "I never believed my dad," she said. "Never once did I think he was seeing that thing." After some encouragement from me, she finally told me that when he was alive, my great-grandfather would constantly pace on the nights of the full moon. He was a large Native American man with a very stern face and deep voice. He was never known to be afraid of anything, except on the nights of the full moon. He'd hold a piece of metal pipe in his hand, and his yellow Labrador Vernon was by his side, just waiting. When people asked him what he was doing, he would say, "I'm waiting for that wolfman to show his ugly face." My grandmother told him, "Dad, you're not seeing any wolfman. You're just drunk or you're crazy." And he'd reply, "I know what I saw. I know what I know. That thing has been stalking me for years, but the son of a bitch is too much of a chicken to come out and get some of this." He'd say that while raising the pipe. My grandmother never believed our legends until the same encounters with my great-grandfather would start happening to me. I didn't learn much of the legends until after my first encounter, and she feels it can't be a coincidence that the same beings that her father spoke of have now started presenting themselves to me. If I said I wasn't scared, I'd be lying. Gaining more knowledge is one thing, but looking for trouble is stupid in any sense. I'll learn from a distance, if that makes sense. I strongly suggest that you stay indoors on the full moon. Chances are you have no idea what's out there stalking you. And while ignorance is bliss, curiosity killed the cat. After separating with my ex-wife, I decided to speak to an elder in my tribe. He reluctantly told me that the cursed enemies have gotten more powerful and can sometimes become semi-beastly even without the full moon. It led me to the conclusion that the Dogman I saw in 2016 was actually the same creature I saw in 2014 in his completely cursed form, and that he positioned himself by stalking me. I don't think it's the same thing my great-grandfather dealt with, though. I truly believe they're a father and son pair. I held on to that license plate number, and I had it ran by a police officer relative. I learned this man's name. I'm not going to list it, but just know that it's an extremely generic name, more common than my own. In August of 2019, I was sent to a small town called Magnolia, still here in Texas. I was to pick up a canceled order and had a helper who I'll just call E for his privacy. The property was gated, surrounded by woods on all sides. I called the superintendent and got the code. There were cameras overlooking the property, which is common, so I didn't think much about it. E and I started picking up the material and loading it onto my truck. We were laughing and joking when the howling started. Now keep in mind, it's daylight at this point, so I wasn't that disturbed until that deep howl began. E looked at me and asked, "Amigo, what is that?" and did the sign of the cross on himself. I replied, "I have no idea," truthfully not wanting to think about the nagging memories that have never really gone away. And then as suddenly as it all began, it all just stopped, and we continued our work in silence. After that, I heard screeching brakes and noticed a black sedan blocking our exit. Still not thinking much about it, I continued to load the truck. "Blake," E said with a nervous look on his face. I looked over to see a middle-aged woman with dark hair wearing jeans and a black t-shirt had gotten out of the passenger side, pointing a Winchester at my head. I immediately raised my hands and said, "Ma'am, there's no need for that. You can have anything you want." She smirked and said, "You've got no business on my property stealing from me, little boy." I told her, "I'm not stealing from you, ma'am. I'm here picking up a canceled order. I'm sure you can see my company's logo on my truck, and I'm more than happy to show you the pickup instructions on my paperwork." I won't bore you with what followed after this. She read my papers, called my job, and argued with my management for a little while before hanging up. She looked at me and said, "I apologize for pointing a gun at you. Seems the superintendent, who we fired, failed to mention that you guys would be picking it up here." "No harm, no foul," I told her. She didn't say anything, but instead answered her vibrating phone. I listened. She said, "Hey, honey. No, they were just picking up the material. No break-in or anything. Hold on." She paused and looked at me. "What's your name, Blondie?" she asked me. "It's Blake," I said. Saying this made her smile in a way that chilled me to my core. Whoever was on the phone, she told my name was Blake, and then continued smiling, this disgusting smile. "Okay, love, I'll make sure he knows," is what she said into the phone. Then she hung up the phone and looked at me. E had finished strapping the truck and got into the cab at this point, so it was just the two of us. The lady and I continued to stare each other down. "It seems my husband remembers you," she told me. "You might have heard him and our son making their noises." That was right before I got here. "You see, our boy just turned 18. She was saying this, and her smile was getting wider and wider, like she was noticing the horror on my face and it was making her happy. "He saw you on the camera. Says you guys met twice in Katy, and once in North Shore over the past few years. He wanted to say hi and hopes you're doing well." "Tell him I said hi right back, and let him know that I have nothing to be afraid of. Have a good day, ma'am." With that, I got into my truck. I waited for her to walk back to her car, and then I raced the hell out of there. E and I didn't talk the entire ride back to our office. I could tell he was shaken, but I had no desire to explain myself. 3 times. 3 times this creature remembered me. Coincidence? I don't think so. There's no conclusion to this story. I still don't go out on the full moon because despite knowing that I can't be harmed, the people around me can. My advice remains the same. If it's stupid to do in a horror movie, it's stupid to do in real life. Curiosity kills the cat. I'm the lucky survivor. Don't be the unlucky victim of the never-ending hunger and rage of this beast. I will send any future encounters to the supernaturalist. It's an honor to be part of your journey. Sharon Russell's tale is another one of those stories that sort of defies the expectations of an encounter. Like Blake's first encounter, this werewolf actually had torn up clothing on it. Now, I have no idea if it was something that it was wearing because it knew what clothing was for, or if that torn up shirt was caught on it when it killed someone, or if these creatures really do change from man to beast and whoever it was wearing that shirt when they turned. But after talking with Sharon numerous times, and even having a Facebook friendship with her, I know she's confident in what she saw. Among other things, she's a medium herself, and she's no stranger to the paranormal. So maybe that's why this thing was attracted to her. Throw in the fact that no animal in her area could match the description of the thing that she saw, and we have a bona fide werewolf encounter on our hands, ladies and gentlemen. From what I can gather, werewolves typically seem to be more aggressive than most dogman specimens. Unless, of course, we're talking about the ones in the LBL, right? But maybe that's why this thing was so hostile with her. Because it was a werewolf. But again, there's the theory that these creatures feed off of fear. And who better to terrify than some poor child just walking to her friend's house? I felt horrible for her when I read this for the first time. No child should ever have to be that scared, or see something that scary. No person should ever have to be that scared either. But there's this certain innocence that children have, and I don't even know how she managed to find the bravery to escape what she did. I've talked with her many times over the years, and I'm pretty sure she still listens to this channel. So Sharon, this one's for you. Your bravery is inspiring. My name is Sharon Russell. I've been an established medium and remote viewer all my life. I have a dogman encounter that I want to share with you. It happened in 1975, and I was only 14 years old. My encounter happened in the Memorial Park in Wickford, Essex in the UK. This thing came from the River Crouch, which runs under the bridge where I encountered it. This river runs through miles and miles of wild country. To get to the gates, you have to walk through an open field that's about 200 to 300 yards from the roadside to the gate. At this point, I thought I had seen my friend Elizabeth at the gates, but she disappeared quickly from view. I hurried as fast as I could while carrying 2 heavy overnight bags. When I got there, I didn't see Elizabeth, so I stopped to look around and call out her name. I told her I knew she was there, so she should come out. I wasn't afraid. If she was trying to scare me, it wasn't going to happen. I heard some rustling sounds off by the left side of the thicket, which you would have to go through to get down to the riverbank. I heard some splashing in the river to the left side and called out to Elizabeth again, but she still didn't answer. When I heard splashing to the right side, I didn't even think that she could be over in the river at this time. I just giggled nervously and looked around, still calling out for her. Then the atmosphere grew stronger. Because of hearing more than one rustle on either side of the bridge, it was all getting stranger and stranger. On top of that, it was starting to get misty. Plus, hearing odd sounds in 2 different areas, I figured she brought our friend Linda with her. But they still didn't come out, so at this point, I started to get annoyed. I called out that I was going on, that they weren't scaring me, and that this was now boring me, so I headed for the bridge. I was still getting creeped out though, and was constantly trying to shrug those feelings off. I was still hearing the rustling in the bushes as I continued to the bridge, now louder, but behind me. It was near dark, but the lighting of the bridge still allowed me to see just fine. That's when I heard someone walking up behind me. At first, I didn't turn around. I figured Elizabeth would try to scare me, but then I heard the heavy footing and the slapping noise, and I knew it couldn't be her. I was too afraid to turn around. I knew it wasn't her or Linda behind me. The footsteps were just too heavy. My brain was going into overdrive. I was trying to analyze the situation. Then this horrific growl came from behind me. It was so loud, it rumbled my chest, my heart, and it felt like it took my soul out of my body. I just froze. It had come up from behind me, and going by the growl, it was taller than Elizabeth. I knew it had stopped right behind me, because the footsteps stopped, and I could feel the warm heat on the back of my neck. That's when I had to force myself to turn around. I turned around only halfway, and there it was, right in front of me, only about 4 or 5 inches away from me. A werewolf. It let out another low, bellowing growl in my face. I froze and actually wet myself right there on the spot. It had a dog face. It snarled and showed its teeth to me, and I was hit by its stinking breath. As I went into shock, my brain started to process a million details all at once. I thought to myself then that I was going to die, that it was going to kill me, and it was going to eat me. It looked like a wolf, but not a cute little wolf. This thing looked like a werewolf. I don't even like to say that word now because it causes me so much fright, but this thing that was standing so close in front of me looked just like a werewolf. It had huge teeth and fangs. I noticed flesh hanging off of its gums. Its hair was brown, with little bits of black mixed in. The hair was like a wolf or a bear. It had deep orange-red eyes, and they were full of the most intense rage imaginable. It continued to growl at me. The fear I felt was like nothing I've ever experienced. What I noticed was how its brow was creased while it snarled, and its movements with its expression. The eyelids themselves were almost bald, but the hair around it was darker. The brow hung over quite a bit. The nose looked almost bald and looked shiny, like it was wet. The ears were pointed, not as big as you hear. They were kind of small, pointed with hair on the ends, and the skin looked leathery. The neck, though, was thick, and the head was extremely huge, 3 or 4 times larger than a German Shepherd dog. The shoulders were protruding, just like huge muscles, like the Hulk. It had a hump on its back, and it made its neck look even more muscular. The arms were thick with hair, and it had hands, not paws. It had really long fingers. The claws looked half human, like they were stained and full of mud. They were probably 3/4 of an inch to an inch long. His face was so close to mine that I had to turn my head and just move my eyes around to see him. I needed to know what I was looking at. It was in a bent position, coming down to my level, sniffing me. My brain wasn't convinced that this thing was real still, yet the evidence told me that it was. Its chest was exposed, and quite bald, but it was rippling, absolutely rippling, with muscles. I couldn't see past the waist at this point. The weirdest part of this thing, though, was it had a ripped, shredded, dirty checkered shirt on. It was a sleeveless checkered shirt. It had ripped, dirty tan pair of trousers, but the clothes looked ancient. They were torn, bloodied, and filthy. Plus, did not fit them. The clothes were so shredded, they were hanging off of this thing. I looked down at the legs, and they looked exactly like a dog's legs, except for the huge feet. They looked partly human with large nails. It only had partial hair on the top of the feet. The legs were just like a dog's legs. They were bent back at the hock, but extremely muscular. I estimate that this thing was about 6.5 feet tall, maybe 6'8". I could not see if there was a tail. But it absolutely stank. It smelled like blood and dead animals. It was so smelly that it actually took my breath away. The scariest part for me at that moment was the aura that this thing gave off. It was like it was sucking my soul from the fear that it gave me. That's when my brain kicked in and I decided I needed to run for my life because this thing was going to rip me to pieces. I knew I was dead. I knew this thing was going to kill me, but I had to push that fear from myself because I was absolutely frozen in it. I had tried to pry my hands open so I could release those heavy bags that I was carrying. Then, maybe I'd have more of a chance to run faster. I forced my frozen body to prepare for the run. I had to get away from it, and still at this point, it continued growling at me, all the while drips of drool dropped on my neck with its hot, stinking breath. All of this happened in seconds, but I was processing it all so extremely fast. And then, I dropped all my bags, which made it move just enough for me to escape, and I ran for my life across that bridge. But I knew that I was still going to die, for it gave chase to me, keeping up and close to my back. I ran up the embankment, across the field towards an alley, screaming the whole time, hoping my friend would be on her way and that she would see me and save my life. I honestly don't think I took one breath the whole time I was running and shouting and screaming for help. All I remember is my own voice and my screams the entire time, plus the sound of thumping feet and growls behind me all the way. That dogman gave chase and it stayed on my heels the whole time. I knew any minute it was going to grab me, pull me down and end my life. But, for some reason, it didn't. I knew I couldn't outrun it. There was absolutely no way. It could have easily taken me down whenever it wanted, but it let me go at the point of the alley, and a bright light appeared. I ran to my friend's house, and I almost tried crashing through the door. I banged on it until they let me in, and I fell to the floor, screaming and crying in hysterics. I started to yell at them that a werewolf was chasing me, and they needed to shut the door. As they talked to me, I could register that I was being talked to, but I couldn't register what they were saying to me. All I could hear was the growl in my ear. It was stuck with me or something. I couldn't hear anything else. Of course, they wanted to go investigate and get my bags, but I begged them to stay inside. I didn't want them to get killed by that thing. But Elizabeth's dad insisted going, even though I was hysterically begging him not to, and he wasn't gone that long. He came back with my bags and said they were right where I had dropped them on that bridge. He made a comment about him shivering down there by the bridge, and that he couldn't get back quick enough. It was like something there creeped him out too. The doctor was then called, and I was sedated to calm me down. After that, it didn't get much better though. I had terrible nightmares for years and years. I tried hypnotherapy among other things, but that didn't work either. I still cannot really talk about it too much without getting frightened. I'm stronger now, although still afraid of the darkness, but I'm finally starting to talk about it all these years later. I did an interview with Daniel Stedman once. 11 days after that, I finally started talking about it to more people. But the nightmares have come back. Just not as bad as before. I could easily face any demonic horrors in my life, except for this thing. It leaves you with absolute terror, and it's a terror that you will not ever forget. I have a hard time dealing with the fact that it let me go. I know I should be grateful, but all I have to ask was, why didn't it kill me? Why did it chase me if it was just going to let me go? Why did it make itself known to me in the first place if it wasn't hunting me? Is it not finished with me yet? I actually think I interrupted a feeding or something, and that's why it had flesh on its teeth. I believe there's more intelligence to this creature than a dog, or wolf, or maybe even a human being. It's absolutely a unique creature. When I looked into its eyes, I felt like it knew me, like a human, even though this was some sort of beast. These things are real. I saw every part of this thing move. It growled, it drooled. The drool hit my face. The breath was hot and the growls were deafening. It definitely wasn't somebody dressed up in some Halloween costume. Hearing that other people have had encounters that are frightening as mine still scares the hell out of me. I fear for them, and I cry for some too. Thank you for telling this story on your new channel. And I give you this. Please don't look for these creatures. They are highly dangerous. Just because I survived doesn't mean you will. They choose their victims. Sharon. The first time I actually heard Danielle's encounter was on an episode of Vic Cundiff's show, and I actually took the long way home from work just so I could keep listening to it uninterrupted. I was fascinated by it. This was a while before I even started my channel, but as soon as I did, I knew that I wanted to present her story someday. She was actually starting up her own channel around the same time as me, so we really hit it off. We even talked on the phone a few times, and she was always so polite and down to earth. We talked about what happened to her, and even all those years later, you could still hear the fear in her voice when she talked about it. A few years into my channel, I reached out to her and asked permission to share her story. She was delighted to have me do it. I sent her my script to make sure everything was perfect, and I got to recording it. It's still one of my favorite Dogman encounters to tell because it's so horrifying. I mean, can you imagine being trapped in a car with an actual monster outside and having no way to escape because you don't have the keys to the car that you're in? Her experience still baffles me, because this dogman had every chance to rip that car apart to get to the girls inside. Yet, all it did was give them a lifetime of nightmares. I've heard people talk about these creatures, and how they seem to enjoy the fear that they cause. And this encounter sort of makes me think that's true, because it didn't really do much to them other than terrify them. Danielle's also the first person that told me about Taylor, Mississippi, and we all know what goes on there, right? Talk about places where the veil is thinner, well, there's a hot spot for you right there. During the camping trips that I like to take with my friends, I'm always the one that they want to hear stories from, because this is what I do. I present scary stories, and because of that, I have a ton of them. Well, last summer, I was with some coworkers and told this story. We were out in the middle of nowhere. It was probably past midnight at this point. I decided to tell this one because it's so damn scary. When I finished it, nobody wanted to hear anything else because one of them was scared so bad. And one of the people even said, "We probably shouldn't tell these stories in the dark. We won't be able to sleep." So now I know, anytime I go out camping with people, this one is sure going to be one that I tell. Hope you guys enjoy it. Danielle Stedman grew up in the woods. Her father raised her to hunt and fish, so she knows her way around the forest and the creatures that live in them. What happened to her was no case of mistaken identity. She was only 14 years old when she had her encounter with a dogman, and it was a particularly disturbing one. One night, she was out with her friend Jill. It was around October of 1987. She had snuck out of the house around midnight to see her boyfriend. They went to pick up Jill and Jill's boyfriend. They ended up parking at the end of a long dirt road because her boyfriend's 1969 Camaro was so loud. He figured they would park and then he'd walk down the dirt road to get Jill's boyfriend. Danielle and Jill were left in the car alone, listening to music and talking. About 10 minutes later, Danielle was the first one to notice the smell. She described it as the worst smell she's ever smelled. Musty, like the smell of a wild boar. Pungent, like rotted meat and metallic smell of blood. Jill didn't notice the smell at first, until Danielle pointed it out to her. It was so bad, in fact, that they had to cover their noses with their shirts. Danielle was certain that whatever was causing the smell was not there when they first arrived. She never would have let her boyfriend park the car there if it smelled like that. Jill, though, shrugged it off and offered the idea that the smell just hadn't reached them yet. Soon after that, maybe 5 minutes, maybe less, They felt a small nudge at the back of the car, like someone gently rocking it back and forth. They both quieted down, having felt the movement. They were scared, but realized if their boyfriends had run through the field, they could already be back. They decided it must be the boys playing a prank and decided to ignore them. They couldn't see out of the windows at this point, because they were fogged up from the girls being inside for so long. The car was nudged again, and again they ignored what they thought was a playful trick by their boyfriends. When the car moved more forcefully the next time, the girls had had enough and yelled at the boys to knock it off. But they got no reply. The car rocked back and forth again, once again more forcefully than before. The girls called out to their boyfriends once again, telling them that their prank wasn't going to work. They weren't scared. Until the car was hit from the front this time. The force of the movement was downright violent. Danielle didn't think her boyfriend would do that to his beloved car. They tried looking out the windows, calling once more for the boys that they thought were outside. But still, there was no answer. The car shook violently one more time before the girls screamed that they were scared, that the boys won. Now they could get in their car and they could go about their night. But that's when the growling started. It was low, like a dog, but sinister and evil. They felt it in their chests. The hair on the back of their necks stood up. This wasn't an ordinary growl. There was something troubling about it. Danielle looked at Jill. All the blood in her face was drained. They started to hear a deep scratching noise that started at the front of the driver's side and came to the driver's side door. Danielle now knew that this couldn't be her boyfriend, because he would never, ever do that to his own car. More terrifying still was the fact that when whatever it was that was out there got to the door handle, it actually tried to lift it. Danielle flew to the unlocked door and slammed the lock down, putting herself inches from the creature. Only the foggy glass of the driver's side window separated her from the unseen attacker. She knew that it was staring at her, and it sent her into a primal type of fear. She was frozen. She knew her life was in danger. She could feel it. Yet she still had no idea what was out there. She had to know, though. She had to know what was stalking them. Even though the thought of facing it was terrifying. She reached up and smeared a small spot of fog away. What she saw was a nose. A muzzle. The muzzle looked like a German Shepherd or a wolf. The monster snorted when she did this, and its breath fogged the glass on the other side. The dogman stood up seconds later, on its hind legs. It grabbed the car, and with another sinister growl started shaking the whole Camaro back and forth so violently that it sent both girls into hysterics. Jill was still in the back seat. Danielle was in the passenger seat. They were trapped inside the car as the dogman loomed outside. As it shook the car back and forth, it growled. In fact, it seemed the more noise that the girls made, the more violent this beast became. Danielle curled up on the floor, making herself as small as she possibly could, and told Jill to do the same. Suddenly, the car stopped shaking. But that wasn't the end of it. The dogman started moving around the car, and it sounded to Danielle like it was still on 2 feet. They watched the silhouette of this thing move around the back of the car. Danielle noted the shape of the paws and the size of the creature outside of the car. The front paws of this thing didn't resemble a wolf's. In fact, Danielle wouldn't even use the term paws at all. She would call them hands. They looked like a raccoon's hands, able to hold on to things. She'd estimate this beast to be 7 to 8 feet tall. When she peered through her small viewing hole, she also saw male genitalia and long arms. The whole upper body was up in the air, above the top of the car. They watched and listened as it crashed back down onto all fours, and to their absolute horror, they heard it start playing with the latch of the trunk. They knew it was trying to get into the car with them. They knew that if it did get in the car, that would be the end. Danielle was dumbfounded. What kind of animal can not only walk on two legs, but smart enough to know what a door handle is. She reached up to lock her own door. The sound of it caused the monster to stop what it was doing and ran to Danielle's door. As the beast sniffed loudly around her door, only inches from her, it started pulling at the door handle. She did the only thing she could do. She grabbed the handle to keep it down. What followed was the world's scariest game of tug-of-war. The dogman was trying to open the door. Danielle was trying to keep the door closed. She knew, though, that her efforts were pointless, because if this thing got in, there was nothing she could do. As the dogman yanked on the door, it snarled and growled. Both girls cried and screamed from inside the car. They screamed at this supernatural animal to stop, to leave them alone, to go away. And as if their prayers were answered, the growling stopped and the car stood still. They stayed in their hiding spots, listening for sounds that it was still out there, but everything was quiet. Had it run off? Was it waiting, trying to trick them into thinking that they were safe, giving them a false sense of hope that it had ran off and their lives would be spared? They couldn't tell over their tears. But being the brave survivalist that Danielle was raised to be, she knew she had to look out the window again. They needed to be sure. She slowly rose from the floorboard and peered outside. The monster was not gone. Now she was looking at it right in the eyes. The amount of detail she observed was incredible. The sheer size of its massive head made her jaw drop. It had the head the size of a grizzly bear. Even as the amber yellow eyes peered back, she took in all the details that she could. She estimates it to be over 600 pounds. Extreme muscle mass all over this creature's body. The head resembled a shepherd's, although so much bigger. Black hair accented its muzzle and around its eyes, but also a tinge of gray, like this thing had started to age. Long, tall ears with tufts of fur coming out from the inside of them, and the tops like a bobcat. She could see a long scar running across its snout and another over its right eye. She was looking at a monster. Something that couldn't exist. She thought to herself that she was face to face with an honest-to-God werewolf. Something made this werewolf-like monster glance down the dirt road, and it dawned on Danielle what was going to happen. The boys should be back any minute now, and they had no idea that there was a monster waiting outside of the car. Danielle feared the worst, that this monster was going to kill her friends, and then come back and kill them too. It glanced back at Danielle and snarled, showing her its huge teeth, and then darted off in the other direction. She watched as this thing moved lightning fast on all four legs, running at a slope almost like a hyena. She saw no tail, but again took in the massiveness of this creature. Even on all fours, this thing was bigger than her. Not a minute later, they heard the sounds of the boys' laughter coming their way and saw the flashlight beams bouncing as they walked towards the car. The girls frantically got them in the car, unable to describe what happened, only repeating over and over through their tears that they needed to leave. They were in hysterics, begging them to get the hell out of there. And then, the most unearthly howl sounded from the darkness. All four of them heard it. Danielle reached across her boyfriend and tried to crank the car into gear. Finally, he drove the girls home. They again tried to tell their boyfriends what happened, but there was no way that they could explain it. How on earth could you tell two people that hadn't witnessed this thing that a werewolf had attacked the car, that it was standing outside trying to get in and looking at them for so many minutes? That night, Once she was home, Danielle looked out of her bedroom window more times than she could remember, making sure that that thing didn't follow her home. The next day, her boyfriend came over to show her something. The roof of his car had 2 handprints on it, one at the front of the car, the other at the back. Danielle realized how long the arm span of the monster she encountered had to have been. Then she saw the driver's side of the car, the claw marks that the girls had heard the night before. They were deep enough that he ended up having to get the car repainted. The boys believed them, especially after hearing that god-awful howl. They knew that the 2 of those girls had witnessed something horrific, but still, they never talked about it again. To this day, Danielle still suffers from the effects of this encounter. She always carries a gun, even though she isn't sure that it would stop a dogman. She likes to have the lights on at night, especially the nights that she has nightmares. And she likes to have her large breed dogs around her, just in case. She gives this advice: don't be afraid of the dark. Be afraid of what's in the dark. Desolation Wilderness. Yet another place that I've actually been to myself. I often wonder how close I've actually come to a dogman and had no idea. A long time ago now, I'd just gotten out of this horrible toxic relationship with this doctor that I used to have a thing with, and I desperately needed to get out of town for a few days. My best friend told me that we should go camping. It was perfect. I love camping. It was a way to get the hell out of Dodge for a few days. Another doctor that I worked with told me about this spot right up around Desolation Wilderness, and actually drew us this awesome map of her perfect spot. We went out there, and it was the best camping trip that I've ever been on. Literally, the only person I saw the whole time was my buddy that I went with. But out there, dark is freaking dark. Like pitch black. You can't see anything else. That darkness is definitely eerie. Throw in the fact that when we were sitting around the campfire one night, we heard coyotes sounding off on either direction of us, making it seem like they were starting to surround us, and I know the kind of fear that the darkness can instill. But hearing coyotes sounding off in the distance is not even close to being as scary as what this man witnessed in the Desolation Wilderness. This is one of my favorite encounters because instead of running and hiding, this dude actually decides he's going to go fight the dogman if it comes to it. Think Arnie preparing to fight the predator. Just how badass do you have to be to mount up against a monster? When I was first reading through this email, I could actually feel the claustrophobia in this atmosphere. He's out in the huge forest, literally out in the wilderness. There shouldn't be claustrophobia, but it just felt like he had nowhere to go. I mean, even the word desolation is a synonym for isolation and despair. So you know, hearing this story, that something bad's gonna happen, right? Well, after I read his email, I read it a second time, because it was so interesting. The forest is only about 2 hours from where I used to live, too, so I was really excited to have something so close. Of course, I wasn't about to go out there and look at it myself, because, hey, I'm more of a researcher than an investigator, but I read the email, showed it to my buddy that I went with, told him this happened right where we went camping, and he said he believes it. Because the trees are so thick up there, it's the perfect place for something like that to hide. So without further ado, here is the Desolation Wilderness Dogman experience. Hello to you, Supernaturalist, and all the creatures of the night listening in. I just wanted to start by telling you that you have done a lot of good in your work, getting people's stories out there and helping them come to terms with what they have seen. To quote Agent Mulder, the truth is out there. My name is Corey Fitzpatrick. I'm 29 years old and I live in Sacramento, California. I'm a computer tech by trade, but an avid outdoorsman by heart, and I love camping and hiking on my spare time. I'm married to my college girlfriend, and we have 4 children together, ranging from 8 years old to a year and a half. I have seen the Dogman, experienced the terror that everyone talks about during an encounter, and I live to tell the tale about it. It was the most intense night of my life, and there were times I wasn't too sure I'd make it home to see my family. But with God on my side, and maybe a little bit of good luck too, here I am. It was the summer of 2016, and I was on one of my routine camping trips. I'd go off by myself and camp for a few days, like I'd done since I was 16 years old. My wife was fine with it, since she would go on her girls' weekends too. It was just our way of taking care of each other's sanity. This was my weekend to relax, to hike, and to get back in touch with nature. I know it sounds cheesy, but it's just what I do. Typically, I'd park somewhere off the road, grab my supplies, and hike into somewhere off the beaten path. I'd walk as far as I could, sometimes hours before I pitched my camp. I love spending time out there all alone. Usually, there'd be no cell service where I was. That's just something that happens up there, so I wouldn't even bother having my phone on me. During this particular trip, I didn't even bother to charge it, which wasn't the first time that happened. This encounter happened in the El Dorado National Forest, near Desolation Wilderness. It was the evening of August 12th, and it's something I will never forget. As terrifying as it was also one of the most significant things that I have ever experienced, apart from marrying Diane and the birth of our children. What I witnessed was truly life-changing. To cut to the chase, I was out wandering around, enjoying the forest and breathing the fresh, wild air. I was about 20 or 30 minutes from camp. I had a pack with water, some snacks, my lunch, and emergency supplies, but I also had my sidearm with me on one hip and a buck knife on the other, just in case. The first thing I noticed was this weird, almost electric charge around me, like the air was static or something. It was weird, and I've never experienced anything like that before or since. It was enough to get me to stop and look around. The trees up there are spread out enough to get a great visual of your surroundings. There was nothing around that shouldn't be. The birds were making noise, the bugs were chirping, just your normal nature noises. But then I heard this roar, but not like anything I've ever heard before. Yes, there is the possibility of running into a bear where I was at, but this was not a bear that I heard. It didn't sound very close either, so I had the thought that whatever was making the noise could be distorted through the granite clearings where I was. But still, the roar mixed with that static made me feel kind of antsy, and it made me think twice about continuing to wander around. So I decided to sit for a little while, taking in everything around me, trying to listen for any other roars or strange sounds like I had heard. It was the first time ever that I wished I had my phone, even if it was just a simple text to my wife. Heard a weird roar. Alas, my phone was in my tent, and I doubted it was even charged. I knew it wouldn't have service. So I ate my sandwich, listened to the birds some more, and then eventually got up to head back to my campsite. And that's when things started to turn into an episode of the X-Files. On my way back, I caught the whiff of something that, to me, smelled like old, rotting flesh, with the hint of wild animal urine. When I was younger, my uncle had some property out in Oakdale, and he had a cow that had died and started to rot. It smelled like that. I had stumbled upon some carcasses in my past, so, once again, being a very naive guy, I just figured something had died and the wind was bringing the smell to me. I never in a million years thought I would be smelling a dogman. Alas, that's exactly what it turned out to be. I continued to head back to my camp, but the whole time I kept smelling this nasty, rotting smell with the urine wrapped into it. Then everything went quiet. I'm talking mute on a TV, no sound at all quiet. That wasn't normal. That wasn't something I could just rationalize away. I started thinking of that movie Dead Silence, where that old lady possesses the dolls and makes everything go completely silent. Then if you scream, it kills you. So you can imagine how high I jumped when I heard this growling noise coming from behind me. I nearly had a heart attack while jumping out of my skin. I turned around so fast, I almost lost my balance. I unclipped my pistol and pulled it out. And then I saw what made the noise, and almost dropped the damn gun. I was looking at a gigantic wolf, but it wasn't like anything that I'd seen, except in my nightmares. It was probably 100 feet away from me, maybe even less than that. But with the gray rocks around it, it made everything that much more visible. This thing was gigantic. It had to be at least 4 feet tall on all fours. Its front legs were bulging with muscles, but that didn't even compare to the back legs. They looked like bodybuilder legs. It had long, dark brown fur all over its body, like the length of a collie's hair, and it looked fine and groomed in some places, but patchy and matted in others. Its front paws were splayed open, like if you stretch out your hand as wide as your fingers will go. And those fingers it had were long, not short and stubby like dog toes. These looked more like raccoon hands, or even people hands. Its head was wild. It looked like a cross between a wolf and a monster, just like a werewolf. Although, I'm not going to use the term werewolf, because this was something different. It was intelligent. It had this long, thick muzzle, like it had powerful jaw muscles, and these ears that perked straight up on top of its head. Its shoulders were up higher than the head, and the elbows were pointed outwards, like someone in mid-push-up. And it just stood there, motionless, staring at me while I stared back at it. I don't know if my brain was trying to catch up with my eyes, or if I was just dumbfounded by what I was looking at. But I didn't move a muscle either. My gun was in my hand, just hanging at my waist, completely useless. I think I whispered something along the lines of, "Holy shit," to myself. Then this thing tilted its head at me, like it was trying to make sense of me, or something. And then the craziest part happened. It looked down at my gun. It moved its entire head to look at my gun, and then looked back up at me. This thing snarled and bared all of those lethal teeth, and it pushed up with its arms as it rose to 2 feet. This thing was actually standing on 2 feet, just like a damn person. I heard this popping sound while it did that. I don't know if it came from the Dogman or if it broke a stick or something, but I definitely heard something pop. Now I saw how truly gigantic this thing was. It had to be 9 feet tall. Everything about it was massive. I saw boy parts down below. He wasn't lacking in that area, if you know what I mean. He stood there, panting in this wild rage, like a gorilla does when it's pissed off, and it snarled at me again before it started to back off. And when I say back off, I mean it actually backed away. Like walked backwards, still keeping an eye on me, and still snarling at me. Then I guess it felt it was far enough away, and it turned around and trotted off in the other direction. I watched this thing, still not even moving, except of course for the whole body shakes that I was experiencing. It trotted off on 2 legs, and then eventually got back down to all 4 legs. My hike back to camp was filled with so many thoughts that I can't even really remember the whole hike. Although I do remember looking over my shoulder every few seconds to see if this thing was coming back. Luckily, like I said, the trees there were spread out and sparse, so I had a pretty clear view of all around me. I remember thinking how stupid I was coming out here all alone, always thinking I would never get hurt or have a run-in with a wild animal. I guess it's that invincible mentality. I remember thinking that I wasn't going anywhere that night, since it was already late and there was no way that I could make it to my car before nightfall. I wasn't about to go hiking down a mountain in the dark, even without a dogman in the area. That wasn't safe at all. And even as terrifying as that thought was, the thing I was most frightened about was the thought of never seeing my family again. At the time, we had 2 daughters, Kristen and Chloe, and they were both still so little. I thought about my wife, having to try to explain to them that they'd never see Daddy again, or worse, that they would never even find my body, and not even Diane would have the closure of what happened to me. That thought made me want to vomit, but that thought gave me strength too. I'd do whatever I had to survive. I started jogging back to camp, trying to save as much daylight as I could. When I got back, I built my fire as big as was safe, and as close to my tent as I could. In my tent, I had my lantern, flashlight, knives, my pistol, and my secret weapon. The shotgun I always kept in my tent for emergencies. I'd never had any run-ins with bears or mountain lions, but that didn't mean I didn't think about what would happen if one of them came into my campsite in the middle of the night. That shotgun made me feel safe. I wasn't sure it would kill the son of a bitch, to be honest, but it sure would slow the mother down, and I didn't even have to be a good shot if it got close enough. I remember waiting for the sun to go down, dreading it for the first time in all the years that I've been doing this. I felt like I was in some kind of scary movie. I felt confident that I'd make it through the night, though. My tent was up against a granite wall. That thing wasn't coming up behind me, and I was at the door of my tent, in between it and the fire. I had my shotgun in my lap, my pistol on my side, and my buck knife on the other. I was ready for that thing to make an appearance. I stayed in front of that fire, tending to it, until I heard those crazy roars again. It was 3:41 in the morning, judging by the time on my watch. They were further off, but still, now that I knew what was making them, it was unnerving. I added a log to the fire, waited 10 minutes, and then went into my tent, ready for that thing to come to me. Let it come to the tent. Let it stick its head in. I had a surprise for it. At that range, nothing was surviving a shotgun blast. The sun usually came up around 6 o'clock or so I only had a couple hours left until daylight. Then I could safely get the hell off the mountain and back to my family with the most unbelievable story that I could ever tell them. I heard something big coming my way at 4:18, and everything else quieted down. It was dead silence again. And then I smelled that horrible smell again, and I thought to myself, here we go. It was heavy, that's for damn sure. On the rocks, you could damn near feel that thing moving around. It stayed far enough away to where I wasn't comfortable taking a shot at it, but I believe to this day that it was that thing that was outside of my tent, because I could hear it sniffing around like a canine would. Deep, heavy breaths. I could hear it throwing rocks around, big rocks, like it was frustrated that it couldn't get to me safely. I know that it recognized what a gun was earlier, and I knew that it knew I still had the gun with me. That was crazy to me. A creature, first of all, that shouldn't even exist, whatever the hell it was, that could recognize a gun and react to it the way that a person would. This went on the rest of the night. It would stomp around my campsite and hit trees or throw rocks. It would sniff around, but it would never come to the tent. I could smell it the whole time. It was beyond nasty. It smelled hella bad. Like rotted meat, animal urine, and old wet fur. I smelled actual urine too, I believe. Like this thing peed somewhere close. It reeked of ammonia, and it made for a pretty nauseating and terrifying night. Around 5:30 or so, the hints of light began to appear, and I guess this thing gave up. It actually grunted, like it was sick of me or something, and I heard it walk off. Although I still stayed in my tent until it was fully light, and when I finally got out, the campsite was littered with wood and rocks and sticks. I broke down my tent as quickly as possible, all the while looking over my shoulder and around me to make sure that that thing wasn't coming back. I hiked back to my car, which was a solid 3 hours away, and got the hell out of there. Once I got home, Diane could tell something was wrong, but I told her it could wait, and I gave my family the biggest, longest hug that they could stand. I told Diane all about it later, and after she made herself a drink and asked me to pretty much tell the story again, she said that she believed me. I've still been out camping a lot since then, although now I usually go with my brother-in-law, and I always have a satellite phone with me. I've never seen the Dogman again, but there are times, honestly, when I'm tempted to go back up there, just to see. You probably think I'm nuts and crazy for doing that, but the way I see it though, if you take the proper precautions, you could definitely get out alive. Although this thing was big and intimidating, it wasn't overwhelmingly aggressive. For all I know, it was just curious about me. It didn't attack me when it could have, while we were face to face. It backed away from a potential fight when it saw my gun, and it stayed away from my tent and just investigated. I know, I'm probably 100% wrong about it, and it would have torn me to shreds if it had the proper chance. But these things are so shrouded in mystery that I can't help but want to learn more about them. Anyways, thanks for listening. I hope you guys can learn from my ordeal. Have a great night. Corey Fitzpatrick. This one here I first heard during COVID. I cut my hours to take care of the kid, and on the nights that she was with her mom, I'd go over down this rabbit hole of Reddit and paranormal message boards. I read about this one in New York and just really fell in love with it. I left a comment for the witness to email me, and it wasn't until a few weeks later that I actually had somebody respond back. He was excited to share his story with me, and we exchanged emails. I sent him the finished product and actually bumped this encounter up in my line because I was so excited about it. With the way that it balanced on the balls of its feet, I would definitely say this was a dogman that he encountered, and not a werewolf. What's interesting is, we hear about these encounters at night all the time, but it's rare that we have such a hostile, aggressive encounter during the day. But here's one nonetheless. Honestly, with the aggression that this thing showed him, I feel like maybe it was protecting something. I've read a few accounts where these witnesses come into contact with a super aggressive dogman that more or less just does whatever they can to scare the crap out of you to the point where you leave the area instead of actually hurting you. And then come to find out, there may be juveniles close by, or a mate, or even a fresh kill that this thing is defending. Now in this encounter, he doesn't talk about anything like that. He only ever saw the one dogman. That's just a theory I have of why this thing was acting so aggressive. With it still being day when he saw this guy, he was able to give us a pretty good description of what he saw, including even seeing a scar under one of the eyes. So before we go into this encounter, I want to ask you this. What kind of animal isn't just tough enough to go up against something as big as this specimen of dogman, but also badass enough to actually give it a scar? Food for thought as you listen to this one. Here's my encounter in the best details that I can remember. It happened to me in New York. I'm an avid outdoor enthusiast. I enjoy hiking, fishing, rock climbing, and just about anything you can enjoy while being outdoors. I was a Boy Scout, and then later on in life I took on the responsibility of teaching kids survival skills, so I'm very acclimated to the woods and all the creatures in them. But when you have an encounter like this, nothing, and I mean nothing, can prepare your mind to handle what I'm about to tell you. It was early summer, and I was going on a solo fishing trip to spend one of the days of my weekend in my favorite spot. It was about a 45-minute hike up a beautiful mountain to this spot, and it's also not very well known. It's a gem of sorts. Only locals are aware of this area. I'd been out there for about 3 hours, and caught one keeper, and was having a really good day. I started to hear what I presumed was another person walking up behind me, and I thought it odd, since I come here often, and I'm almost always the only one up here. But I thought, well, I'm not the only one here who knows that this spot exists. Nobody ever walked up through the path, though. I even yelled hello at one point, and then the walking sounded like it was coming from all around me, but still there was no answer. Just then, I heard a strange kind of growling sound, like a real strange mix of a baby crying and a deep dog growl. When I heard this, I was immediately uneasy. In all my years, I have never heard such a sound in the woods, or anywhere for that matter. All I had on me that day was a small knife and bear spray. I fumbled in my pocket for my knife, and behind me I started hearing heavy walking. So I go and I stand on this flat rock so I can see all around me, but still, nothing was showing itself. This made me even more uneasy. And then from behind a pine, about 60 feet, maybe more, I see what I can only describe to you as the most wicked-looking animal that I have ever seen. This creature has what appeared to me at the time to be a hand with long claws around the tree bracing itself. This thing is slowly peering at me from behind the pine. My first thought was bear, but it just looked too canine to be a bear. I thought this because I guess at the time it's the only two things my mind could put together as to what I was seeing. It had pointy ears like a German shepherd, and I literally saw twisting and turning as if these ears were listening very careful for something. It had medium black fur with some dark brown mixed in, and these massive muscles. It reminded me of those guys who run track. Just an absolutely massive size of muscle. I could feel my whole body trembling with fear. Now, I've encountered mountain lions and even bears and never once felt this kind of fear, but for some reason this thing that I was looking at terrified me. I moved my right hand up slightly. It was the hand that was holding my knife. Why I did this, I don't know. But when I did this thing started running towards me with the agility of an all-star athlete. In fact, its movement seemed almost fake. It ran kind of side to side and was wicked fast. The only thing I could think to do was yell at the top of my lungs while simultaneously waving my hands above my head. And this thing stopped on a dime, so close to me that I can now smell him, and it smells like body odor and wet dog. That smell was so strong, it made my eyes tear. This creature is huffing and beginning to show its teeth. Not like a dog would, almost like it was grinning, almost like it wanted me to make another move. I know it sounds crazy, but I almost felt like it was saying, yeah, come on and challenge me. And when I say grinning, I don't mean like a smile. I mean like the Joker's grin, but more evil. Almost like there's a demonic side of this thing. I remember thinking to myself at that moment, what kind of animal can grin like that? Then it begins to walk in this semicircle in front of me, back and forth, bearing those teeth. And let me tell you, those things were as sharp can be. All the while, it's growling and grunting at me. I looked at its hands. They were bigger than my head. And as it walked, it sort of drew its fingers up into a fist and then released them. It did this a few times. Its hair looked matted in some spots, and in some spots it was longer and smooth, and I could actually see the muscles rippling underneath this thing's fur. These muscles were so big that I didn't think any animal or man could have them unless they were on roids. He would breathe in and out, and when the creature would exhale through its nose, it almost sounded like a horse. It's so close to me now that I could see bits of meat in its mouth, hanging in between its teeth, and leaves in its hair. It had a scar under one eye that almost looked infected, and the eyes looked black with a deep red or maroon tint to them. I can feel this thing's hatred for me radiating off of it. And I know how it sounds that I'm saying that, but it felt like hate was just emanating from this thing. The skin on its face was a deep dark gray, and the inner parts of his hands were the same color, with some spots that were leathery and worn looking. The creature made me feel like an ant in its presence. It had to have been a good 9 feet tall. And I know again that sounds massive and unbelievable, but I promise you I'm not exaggerating. It had feet that were also clawed, and at one point it almost seemed to balance itself on the balls of its feet. I just stood there in this unbearable fear. It gripped me and paralyzed me, and I'm embarrassed to say that I peed on myself. When this happened, the creature began to sniff the air wildly, walking back and forth. Finally, my brain caught up with me, and I did the only thing I could do. I ran. I know that you're not supposed to run when there's a predator around, but I couldn't help it. I left everything behind. My pole, my pack, my fish. I just ran. I ran so fast and so far for so long that my chest was burning. But I could still hear that creature running behind me. I could see him dodging in and out of the trees. And as it ran, it roared. And it roared so loud it made my chest vibrate and my ears hurt, but I kept running. I only looked back a few times to see how close it was. At one point, I remember not hearing anything behind me anymore and finally having the courage to stop. By then, I felt like my lungs were going to fall right out of my chest, that I was just going to fall over and die. I looked all around me, and directly behind me to my right, there he was. His chest was moving up and down, just as fast as mine. He was staring at me, and gave out one last roar. That was enough to make me start running again. I ran back in maybe 20 minutes. How I did that I'll never know. Pure fear and pure adrenaline probably. I remember vividly getting back in my car and having the overwhelming fear come over me that I left my keys behind in my pack, and then relief when I felt them in my pocket. I hopped in my car, sped off, and drove until I got home. I'm almost positive I ran multiple lights, but can you blame me? Of course I didn't mean to, but you have to understand that I was so overcome with fear and shock, I wasn't thinking straight. And believe me, I never went back for my items. It was an expensive pole too, but I didn't care. I just couldn't bring myself to go back, and I didn't want to ask anyone to go with me either and risk them and myself again. I would never put anyone else in danger because of a stupid fishing pole. And why would I tell them that I left everything behind? No one could believe me. It's such an amazing tale. How could you? I've heard stories of Bigfoot and always chalked it up to people having fun telling campfire stories. I never heard of Dogman until I began to do some research after my own encounter. And I'm sharing this because I want to warn others to be aware of the dangers that are truly out there. I want people to know that it's real. I don't know where they come from or how they came to be, but they are truly real, and people deserve to know. Especially people who have families and children who enjoy the outdoors. They should know they need to always be vigilant, always bring protection and be on guard. I'm not saying to live in fear, but just be aware. I'm finally able to go back into the woods again, but it's been years since that encounter. I hope I never see anything like that again. What would the odds be of seeing it a second time anyway? I definitely don't go up to that spot anymore. Thank you for allowing me to share this. And just remember to stay safe out there. Okay, imagine having a job where you go to an old house just to clean out all of the junk. Now imagine being told you can keep whatever junk you want, and how exciting that idea must be. What if you found a trunk full of cash, or an autographed Mickey Mantle baseball card, or the complete collection of Star Trek Voyager on Blu-ray? Now imagine the only thing you found was a creature so big and terrifying that the only thing that you could think is, oh my god, it's a werewolf. Now imagine being trapped in a house that you're unfamiliar with, you have no means to defend yourself, and that big terrifying creature is stalking you from outside, possibly ready to hunt you, attack you, or eat you. Or, all of the above. That's what you get with this encounter. This man, whose name I shall not say aloud, reached out to me with this story, and we spent several weeks just emailing each other back and forth about his experience. He's another guy that I can really consider a friend, even though I've never actually met him. Trapped by Dogman is one of those encounters where you just take an immediate liking to the guy sharing it with you, and you can't help but feel bad for what he went through. It sucks when your whole way of thinking and the life you're used to is turned upside down because of something like this. Reading this for the first time, I found myself just really rooting for him, because he seemed like a really good dude, just minding his own business and doing whatever he had to for a living. I couldn't imagine being out there, excited for a job you've been hired to do, and then having a dogman ruin it all. I mean, after hearing so many encounters over the years, running into one in a situation like that is always on my mind, but he didn't know anything about them or that they were real. Imagine having that as your wake-up call. So here's the one I call Trapped by Dogman. About 10 years ago, I did whatever job was necessary to pay the bills. I split wood, cleaned houses, bussed tables, anything really. Like I said, whatever would pay the bills. The only way that I got my name out there was word of mouth. I'd have friends or people that I worked for just recommend me for whatever was needed to be done. Gardening, farming, I could do it all. Whatever I could do to contribute, just to earn some money. So I was shocked and happy and a little taken aback when I got this call to clear out and do some repairs on this old house. From what I was told, it had been abandoned by its former owners years ago and purchased by someone new. And everything was left in the house. Like they just up and took off one night, not caring what the hell they left behind. Paul wanted all that shit cleared out, and he was going to pay me good money for it. But to top it off, I was told whatever I found in there that I wanted, I could keep. That was really one of the main reasons I took this job, you see. Because this house was about 2 hours away from where I lived, so it wasn't necessarily something I could just drive to and from. But the thought of finding a stack of $100 bills or some jewels in an abandoned safe, or a pot of gold, or even hell, just a cool old jukebox, that was enough to send my mind spiraling and my imagination running wild. It sounded too good to be true. Well, everybody that's listening, let me give you a piece of advice. If something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. I drove over there the first day. I was even told I could spend the night there, or stay as long as I wanted. I could just pack my pickup truck up and take everything out load by load. So I threw some blankets, pillows, and an air mattress in my cab. I was going to stay there, but I wasn't necessarily fond of sleeping on a bed that had been abandoned for God knows how long. Who the hell knows what was on those beds? As I drove there, my mind was still racing at the things I might stumble across. When I got there, though, my first reaction was, who the hell would actually buy this dump? It looked like it was part of an old scary movie. It had shutters that were broken off, the balcony that wrapped around the porch was broken down, the paint was peeling off, the lawn was so dead that it was just dirt at this point. There's a lot of property on it, sure, but this place was going to require a hell of a lot of work by the new owner to make this thing salvageable. I remember thinking if it was me, I would just bulldoze this piece of crap and build a whole new house. Probably what they should have done anyways. So I go in there and start looking around. It was really just a bunch of old junk. Old furniture, pictures of people I didn't know from Adam. But there was this old school record player, but it definitely wasn't a cool old jukebox. 3 bedrooms, 2 bath, and 1 house full of crap. I was disappointed, to tell you the truth. So I go about starting to load up the first batch of junk, which was really just furniture. Couches and chairs, some kitchen tables. I filled the bed of my truck up till I couldn't fit up anymore, and drove a good distance to the dump. I drove back to get some more work done. I worked there all day long, cleaning stuff up. For some reason, there was a lot of broken glass. Not windows, just maybe glasses from the kitchen or picture frames. Who knew? It was like whoever left really did leave in a hurry. After a hard day's work, I sat down on the porch, lit up a cigarette, and enjoyed the sunset. This place just had the power turned back on, so the house was still kind of stale, like the air hadn't been utilized in a long time. So just sitting out on the porch was really a breath of fresh air. That night, though, it was really, really quiet, like the air itself was paused or muted, and there was this, I don't know, a really weird smell, like piss and dirty animal. I had this German Shepherd as a kid, but my dad made me keep it outside. So of course, it got really, really dirty. My dad didn't really pay that much attention to him, and he wasn't a very good owner. That's what that beast smelled like. Whatever the hell it was that I was smelling that night. Piss and dirty animal. Then I heard this, I don't know if it was a growl or rumble. I really couldn't place where it was coming from either, but it was enough to make me stand up and look around, that's for damn sure. The hair on the back of my neck stood up too. I grabbed my pistol and walked around the perimeter of the house. Not out onto the property, just around the actual house. And it seemed on the left-hand side of the house was where that smell was the strongest. It smelled like something just took a piss right there, and had been pissing there for as long as it wanted to. I actually fought back the urge to gag a little bit. I finished my cigarette and walked back to the front of the house to watch the sun finish setting. Before I came here, I didn't know if the power was on, so I had brought my lantern and a flashlight with me. And it was a good thing, too, because I couldn't find any light bulbs besides the ones that was up in the ceiling fan. But this guy didn't bring a ladder, so that wasn't happening. The bedroom I was sleeping in didn't have any light except for the lantern that I brought. I went to bed, but I decided to read for a little bit, so I just sat there reading by candlelight for maybe an hour or so, and then I decided to call it a night. I couldn't have been asleep for more than an hour, but I woke up to this howling. Hell, maybe it was a scream. I don't know. What I do know is that it was unearthly. It was ungodly. It was like something I've never heard before in my entire life. Sadly, though, it wouldn't be the last time. I don't even know how to describe what this thing sounded like. It was not human. Not entirely. It was like an animal and a man combined. A shriek and a scream and a yell and a howl and a growl all at the same time. Now you told me to look up the sound of the werewolf from An American Werewolf in London. It sounded like that, but longer and deeper. This thing sounded bigger. So I bolted out of bed. I grabbed my pistol and my lantern and I turned it back on. I listened again. A couple minutes went by in silence, but then that roar, or whatever you want to call it, sounded off again, and it sent shivers down my spine. I had goose pimples all over my arms and on the back of my neck. I listened, and then I heard it again. It sounded like it was close. Not close enough for me to see, but I guarantee you that it was on the back of this property. I looked out the window to try and see anything, but that road was so far out there, there were no lights around. All I could see was a few feet in front of me, and that thing wasn't showing itself. Not yet, anyway. The moon wasn't very bright that night either. I held my breath, and I waited to see if I could hear it again, but I didn't. I laid back down to try and get some sleep, but I was restless. I was unnerved by what I heard. I probably laid there for another hour. I don't know if this is real time or not. All these situations feel like it could have been an hour, but it could have been more or it could have been less. I don't know. On the room that I was staying in, which was the master bedroom, there's a deck on the back of it that's an extension of the wraparound patio, and the deck connects to a door. As I was laying there, I heard this big boom on the deck, and then something big ran across it. I mean, whatever the hell this thing was took 2 or 3 steps, and then it was gone again. I jumped up and I grabbed my gun. I ran out into the living room and flipped on the light that I knew worked, and I stood there in the middle of the room, just waiting to hear if I heard anything else. waiting to hear that roar or something run across the front porch. But, again, all was quiet. I want to tell you something. I'm a grown man. I camp, I hunt, I know how to fight. Hell, I've been in more bar fights than I want to tell you about. And I don't scare easily. I'm a tough guy. But, for whatever reason, this just unnerved me to my core. So I spent the rest of that night sleeping on the couch with the light on. The next morning, I woke up after just a couple hours of sleep. I was stiff from the couch. My head hurt from lack of sleep, but I knew I had a job to do. The first thing I needed to do, though, was secure the perimeter. So I went out there, blinking from the sun. I had my pistol drawn and ready to fire, and I walked the perimeter of the house again. Walked the area where that rancid smell was. And for some reason, maybe it was just the lack of sleep, maybe it was worse because that smell was stronger. It smelled like something had pissed there again. I have to tell you though that in the daylight, where I could see all around, it was immensely less frightening. In fact, I kind of felt like an ass for even getting so worked up the night before. I started trying to rationalize what happened that night. I tried to convince myself I'd gotten worked up for nothing. That the house had been sitting there, vacant, for Lord knows how long. It was off the beaten path, so there wouldn't be noise complaints or neighbors calling the cops. So, it was probably a pretty popular place for vandals or transients to stay, or even a popular venue for dumb teenagers looking to throw a keg or something. Maybe that even explains why there was glass all over the place. Dumb teenagers doing dumb teenager things. I blamed those noises I heard on my overreaction, and even tried to rationalize them away too. Maybe, again, it was just dumb kids having fun and making noises, or even playing them over a speaker to scare some unknowing gal into the sack by being the big bad protective guy they could huddle close to. Hell, for all I knew, it could have even been a cougar in estrus. The only thing I knew for sure was I felt like a dumbass for the previous night, and I felt so much less anxiety that morning. I walked around the property for a little bit, taking in the vast amount of forest and land behind it. I had my morning smoke, a bag of jerky for breakfast, and set about my day. I actually managed to get a lot of crap loaded up and hauled off. I planned on clearing everything out and then starting the repairs. The only thing that hampered my schedule was how far away the dump was. 45 minutes one way. It would take me a good hour or so to load up my truck. Then I'd have to drive to the dump, unload, which was far less time consuming than loading up the truck. Just chuck everything out of the bed and then drive back. So one load took about 3 hours in itself. I managed 3 loads that day. Good thing this guy was paying for my gas too, right? After what I decided was the last load of the day, I headed back to the house. I considered going home for about 10 minutes. I could wake up very early the next day, drive to the house, start my day, but ultimately I decided against it. I needed to go back there. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't some chicken shit. I stopped at some general store and grabbed some light bulbs. Then I went to a Burger King for a Whopper. Had a fry and soda with that too. And then I stopped at the liquor store to get a little something to add to that soda. I pulled up to the house, got a little unnerved again but shook it off, climbed out of my cab and headed inside. The Whopper was delicious. I had me some extra tomatoes. After my meal, I went back outside to have a smoke. This night, the forest was absolutely alive. Bugs and night things chattered like no tomorrow. I kicked myself in the ass again for being such a pansy the night before. I didn't experience a thing that night, nor the next 3 nights in point of fact. That experience from the first night was all but gone from my mind. I finished loading up all vast quantities of crap from that house, started repairing it, and minded my own business. I even went into town one night for a drink at the local pub, although nobody seemed to notice me, and I kept to myself. Night 5, though, well, Night 5 started a shitstorm of crap that I'm still trying to work through to this day. It was probably around 11, maybe midnight that night, and I heard the most god-awful cries that you could imagine. It was like something was getting ripped apart. Something was terrified, and it was dying. What I heard was definitely death cries. Now, being an avid outdoorsman, I've heard prey get picked off more than once, but the shit I heard that night was like nothing I'd ever heard before. And thanks to God, I've never heard those noises since. And then I heard that roar scream thing again. We're talking immediate goose pimples, hair standing on end, and shivers. It was like the first night all over again. It sounded far off like the first time, but let me tell you, when you hear something like that, it doesn't matter how far this thing is away from you. It's unnerving as all hell. I stood in that room for a good few minutes, trying to decide what to do. Obviously, this thing had the potential to kill something. Those sounds that poor animal made confirmed that for me. Then, the worst thing happened. That scream sounded off again, and it sounded a hell of a lot closer than the last time. Now, I was in a real situation. Do I turn off all the lights and stay quiet, or do I turn all them suckers on and stay in the light? How smart was this thing? It sounded big, but was it big and intelligent? What the hell was it that I was even hearing? I decided to turn the lights on. Hell with being in the dark. I waited to hear the sound again, but I didn't hear it. Instead, something big, strong, and pissed off slammed into the side of the wall outside. The same wall that had that god-awful smell to it. It sounded like someone was out there and slammed their fists on the wall, to tell you the truth. I almost dropped my damn gun. Then I could hear whatever it was walking around the patio outside. I felt like it was circling me. At this point, I was in the living room, and I could hear it walk around the patio outside of the kitchen, then the dining room, and then the living room. This thing sounded heavy. Really heavy. It continued to walk around the patio. Every once in a while, around the front of the house, it would stop, and so would my heart. As carefully as I could, I followed the sounds of it around the house. I didn't go into all the bedrooms, but I stood at the doorways, and could still hear this thing walking around. It circled about 4 or 5 times before it stopped for a little bit. I was dizzy from my heart pumping so fast. I had a million thoughts racing inside my head. What in the hell was going on? Could this just be someone dicking around with me? Maybe it was some druggie that used this house to squat in and was trying to scare me off. Maybe it was a couple of punks looking for trouble. The sound of this thing hitting the wall again pulled me out of those thoughts. At that moment, I made a decision. If it was some punk, I was going to let him know that I was armed. So I yelled out, "If there's someone out there, just know I have a firearm, and I will defend myself if I have to." I heard it run across the patio this time. It sounded bigger than a person. I heard something land on the ground off of the patio. It leapt off of it, I guess. Then that scream again. I still hear it sometimes. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with a person. Or anything that I knew of. After a while, it started circling again, and this time I wanted to get a good look at it. I don't know if it was because I needed to know what I was up against, or if I had some wave of bravery and curiosity, or if I was just tired and annoyed of being so scared. But I wanted to look at this thing. As it went around the corner of the living room, I went into the first bedroom and killed the lights in there. I followed it around the house again, and when it turned that corner, I darted into the bedroom and tried to get a good look out of one of the shutters. All I saw was fur. This thing was massive, taller than I could even tell. I didn't even get a good look at its head at this point. But here's the kicker. The thing that sent me darting from that bedroom, hand over my mouth, eardrums feeling like they were going to explode from the pressure, was that this thing was walking on 2 legs. My mind was racing again. What the hell was that thing? What did it want? Was it going to find a way inside? Was it going to kill me? Was my death going to be fast? Was it going to hurt? I should have called my parents more often. Should have made more of an effort to meet up with my friends. I should have asked Tim and Melvin out on a date in high school. I choked back the urge to vomit. I lost track of where it was. I walked back out into the living room to try and hear it, but there was nothing. I stopped moving, closed my eyes and concentrated on the sounds, but I couldn't hear anything. I stood there for the longest moment, like an idiot, gun in my hands, safety off, ready to go out with a fight. I was staring at the windows, not really looking at anything specific, when I noticed something through part of the broken shutter. I was looking at a damn muzzle and a face, and this thing was looking at me. It found the one spot in the shutters that offered it a glimpse, and it was looking inside. The light was making its eyes glare this dull yellow color, and it looked just like a frigging werewolf. I didn't get too many details, and I'm sorry for that, but I did see where the eyes were, and they looked more intelligent than any animal that I'd ever come across. The fur looked dark, though. I couldn't make out if it was brown or black, but it did have a noticeable color difference between its face and the fur around its head. I yelled out in fright, and this thing bared its teeth at me. I aimed my gun at the wall and fired. I had no intentions of shooting at it, though. I didn't want to shatter the glass and give this thing a direct path to me. Although I doubt the glass or even the door would have stopped this thing if it really wanted to come in. As soon as I fired, this thing was gone. I've seen quick, but this thing could really move. It was like lightning. I heard it land somewhere in the yard again, and then heavy footsteps on the dirt. It sounded like it was running off. I held my breath and listened, still trying not to vomit or pass out. Hell, I was trying not to do both at once. After what seemed like a frigging eternity, this thing screamed again, but it was further away, and I sat down. Exhausted, still shaking. I prayed it would stay away. Far, far away. I kept replaying those 10 seconds over and over in my mind. Seeing it seeing me, shooting at it. My mind wandered over to the thought of how long it was there. How long was it watching me before I even noticed it? This thing was standing absolutely still. Maybe even, I don't know, blending in? I don't know, and I don't want to know. How many times did that thing glance in there and get a good look at me while I was there and didn't even know that it was out there? I sat down on the ground of the living room and stayed there, gun in my hand. I stayed there until daylight. Again, the light of day gave me courage. I could see all around me, and I had never had an encounter with a werewolf during the day. But believe you me, I packed my shit and I got the hell out of there. But when I got outside, I was dumbfounded once again, because there were entrails all over the yard, probably from that poor animal that thing slaughtered the night before. I didn't waste a single second getting in my truck and getting the hell out of there. I drove 2 hours straight home, not stopping for anything, lost in thoughts about what I had just lived through. I called Paul and told him I wouldn't be finishing the job, and that there was some kind of werewolf-type creature out there. That there was some kind of monster stalking his property. He laughed at me. Of course he thought I was nuts. I don't blame him. We argued for a chunk of time. He called me a liar and unprofessional, and said that if I wanted out of the job, to be a man and just tell him. He told me he wasn't paying me. I called him some choice phrases, said I'd get the money I'd earned, even if I had to call my lawyer. I didn't even know a lawyer, but it sounded good. A couple of weeks went by, and I tried everything I could to get the memories to fade away, and eventually I was at least able to sleep at night. Then one day out of the blue, good old Paul called me. He was quiet and sounded scared. "I need to apologize to you," he said. I saw it too. My mouth hit the floor. He said he saw the dogman or werewolf or whatever it was in the middle of the damn day. Just watching him. He got a way better look at it than I did. He put it at about 8 feet tall. Black with brown markings. Big paws. He described them as clawed hands, to be specific. He said it looked like a giant wolf standing on its back legs. Long pointed ears and a long snout. He apologized again and said my check was already in the mail, but he really needed to see me to talk about what was out there. We met up and he said he wasn't going to hire anyone else to go out there. He couldn't in good conscience. He didn't want anyone getting hurt and said he never would have even sent me out there had he known that that creature was walking around the property. I told him no hard feelings. Those things weren't supposed to exist. I kept in touch with Paul for a long time. Mostly through letters and Christmas cards, but once or twice a year we'd meet up for drinks. That thing out there was the only thing we'd talk about when we got together. Paul's passed since then, but I know he shared that story with his wife and his kids, so I'm sure his encounter will live on. As for me, I never married or had kids. I've told my close friends about this. Some believe me, some think I'm dicking with them. Now I just like to go to the bar and people watch. There's this whole truth about what's out there that all these lucky people are perfectly ignorant to. So I guess ignorance really is bliss. That must be nice. I don't think I really need to say why this one's my favorite either. The title's Werewolf Hunter. I mean, this guy talks about hunting freaking werewolves. How cool is that? I mean, just imagine being at a bar and this guy starts talking to you about hunting werewolves. And when he goes outside, he looks up at the moon, and you can tell that he's actually nervous about it. I did this story on this 24 Hours with the Supernaturalist deal that I did on the old channel, so I don't feel that it ever really got to shine. But here this one is in all its glory, and I hope that you guys find this one as fascinating as I do. That's the last one for now. I'm going to do another episode like this because I really had a good time just sharing my insights on all these. And so, with that, here's the Werewolf Hunter. And remember, don't miss your chance to scream. Oh, and don't forget to get a copy of my novel. Link is in the description below. Available on Amazon. Have a good night. Around 25 years ago, I was living in Boston. My friends and I would go to New Hampshire nearly every weekend as one of our group of friends had a family member with a cabin in North Conway in the White Mountains. I had made an acquaintance with an older man and later became friends with him, as we all did. He lived a few miles down the road from us. To preface this a bit, he had served in Vietnam, in combat. He was one of the brightest, most intelligent, and intellectually engaging people that I've ever met. An all-around good person, and a man's man, as the saying goes. If the trauma of service in wartime affected him, I never saw any evidence of it. He had a laid-back, jovial demeanor, a quick wit. His attitude and outlook on life was every day is a very good day. Just an overall joy of a person to be around. I once asked him how he stayed in such a positive, upbeat mood. I was then 20 years old, and like everyone that age, I had what I thought were real problems, and got into bad moods and stuff like that. He told me one night over a campfire, "John, when I was over there in Vietnam, I went through a lot. I saw a lot. I did a lot. Hell. It was hell. I swore to myself that if I ever got back home and got out of that jungle, I would never have a bad day again. And I haven't. It worked for me. It was a great explanation. I never did forget those words. So as you can likely gather, he was a very level-headed, grounded, and intelligent man. Like many in rural New Hampshire and many in wooded areas around there, he always carried a handgun. Always. He carried two, I later found out. They were both identical Smith & Wesson Model 29 44 Magnum revolvers with short 3-inch barrels. Not a very common gun in that particular configuration, so I recall them specifically, even now. He loaded them with hand-loaded rounds. He had cast his own bullets of mostly silver. Yes, I said silver. He carried around silver bullets. Probably a great way to ruin the barrel quickly. He told me and a few of us in a very matter-of-fact tone to never go outside at night if possible. Never. Someone in our group kind of laughed it off and made a remark of some kind. That's when he got very serious. His jovial demeanor that I enjoyed so much was gone. He was very serious and said, "Look, believe me or don't, I'm just trying to save your lives. There are things out here, and they're not supposed to be. They shouldn't exist. Yet, they do. They're not bears. They're not deer. They're not anything that should be walking around, but they do just that. They walk around at night, and none of them have any regard for your lives. Hell, they see you as a food source. They're an apex predator, and they'll think nothing of killing you. So stay in the house at night." Then he walked off. Needless to say, everybody there was extremely creeped out by his little outburst. We were used to him just being calm and collected and funny. This night was different, and he put everybody on edge. But then, the next time I saw him, he was his old self again. We talked a bit, and he told me then that he had seen what he believes were werewolves. Or at least, that was the closest thing he could ever compare them to. He said they were very large and very fast, and he believed very intelligent. Maybe even human-level intelligence. He also told me that's why he carried a heavily loaded 44 Magnum, which for anywhere in New England is really overkill if you've ever been here. But he estimated their weight to be 450 to 500 pounds, their height to be 7 feet or more. He was 6'4" and said they had a foot or more of height on him. He'd been within 20 yards of these things and said they tried to flank him. The main biggest one, which he thought was the alpha, kept his attention, and the other two began what he called the classic flanking maneuver. He fired his gun into the ground as a warning, since he wasn't sure what he was dealing with and wasn't even sure that his gun would even be effective. He fired 2 rounds and then leveled his gun at the one facing him. He said it threw its arms and hands up in a reflective defense posture and then stared at the gun intently, as if he knew what it was and what it could do. It then made a loud noise, and it and the others ran off into the woods. He believes that those noises, or grunts as he called them, were these creatures' way of communicating with each other, and that Alpha called off the attack because he didn't want any of his pack to get hurt. If you know anything about guns, you know a 44 Magnum is loud. A 44 Magnum with a 3-inch barrel is horrendously loud for reference. If this was a normal animal, just the sound of that gun should have scared it off. But he shot, and that thing, which he said was the Alpha, just stared him down for the longest time. He said he felt a primal fear that he's never ever known. And remember, he was in combat in one of the most horrific wars in our history. This was a man who didn't scare easily at all. Whatever he saw scared him to his core. So much so that he warned people not to walk around at night and carried guns on him just to defend himself if he ever came across one of these things again. Hearing him explain all this to me scared me to my core too. And I don't scare much myself. He didn't like being out at night. At all. And wouldn't be out at night often. And in fact, after he told me that, I realized that I normally saw him during the day. Well, that's my input. I've never seen anything like this myself, but a man I believe unequivocally did claim he saw something. I'm curious if anyone has ever had such an encounter with these things, and I'd like to know what you think they are, whether they're a werewolf or something else, and whether or not his silver bullets would have any effect on them. According to him, there's things out there that are so scary, you'll piss your pants when you see them. They hide in the shadows of the night, and they'll feast on your flesh if you're not careful.